Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It was October 12th, 1992. I remember the date clearly because it was my dad's birthday, and I'd promised to bring him some fresh wild pork for his birthday dinner. The feral hog population had been getting out of control around the Sabian River area that year, so I figured it would be a good spot. I got to my hunting spot while it was still dark, around 5:30 a.m. The weather was typical for October in Oregon, cloudy, damp, probably around 45 degrees. There was this light mist hanging in the air that morning, not quite fog, but enough to make everything feel kind of heavy and wet. I had a good spot picked out, an old Douglas fir about 20 feet up with a clear view of a game trail that ran parallel to the river, maybe 150 yards from the water. I'd set up my tree stand there a week earlier after scouting the area and finding lots of hog sign, got myself situated just before first light, around 6:15 a.m. I was using my Remington 700 in .308, topped with a Leupold 39X scope, had my backpack with some water, jerky and basic supplies, plus my hunting knife and a flashlight. The first few hours were quiet. Saw some squirrels, couple of deer at a distance, nothing unusual. Around 9:30, I started hearing hogs moving through the brush, maybe 100 yards to my right. I could hear them grunting and rooting around, getting closer. This was exactly what I'd been waiting for. I got my rifle ready and started watching that section of the trail through my scope. That's when the woods went dead silent. And I mean dead silent. If you hunt, you know what I'm talking about, when even the squirrels and birds just shut up all at once. Every hunter knows that silence usually means something big is moving through the woods. I figured maybe a bear had caught wind of the hogs too, but something felt different, wrong. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and I had this overwhelming feeling of being watched. The hogs came into view first, a group of 5 or 6, moving cautiously now. They were acting nervous, heads up, not really feeding anymore. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just movement behind a thick stand of vine maples, maybe 60 yards past where the hogs were. Something big, really big. And then it stepped out into a partial clearing, and my whole world changed. Through my scope, I had a crystal clear view of... I'm still not entirely comfortable calling it a Bigfoot, but that's exactly what it was. A female Bigfoot. I know it sounds crazy, but it was clearly female. It had breasts, for one thing. The creature was massive. I'd estimate between 7 and 8 feet tall. The fur was this reddish-brown color, like a cinnamon-colored black bear, but different texture. More like human hair than fur, if that makes sense. What really got me were the eyes. Through my scope, I could see them clearly. They were brown, almost amber-colored, and there was intelligence there. Not animal intelligence, but something else. Something that made my stomach drop. The face was... I don't even know how to describe it. Like a cross between a human and a gorilla, but not quite either. The forehead sloped back, and the nose was flat and wide, but it had distinct lips, and the eyes were set like a human's, not like an ape's. I watched, completely frozen, as this thing observed the hogs. It was clearly hunting them. The way it moved was incredible, totally silent despite its size. It would take these slow, deliberate steps, freezing in place whenever one of the hogs would look up. The crazy thing is, it was using the terrain for cover, just like a human hunter would. It knew exactly what it was doing. Then everything happened so fast. The creature suddenly burst from its hiding spot with speed that seemed impossible for something that size. It covered about 30 yards in what seemed like 2 or 3 strides. The hogs scattered, squealing in panic. But this thing, this Bigfoot, it targeted one of the bigger hogs, probably a 200-pounder. What happened next? I still have trouble believing what I saw, even though I watched it through my scope. It caught the hog with one hand, grabbed it by the back leg. The hog was screaming, thrashing around, but this thing, it just lifted the hog up like it was nothing. Then it swung the hog against a tree trunk. The sound... God, the sound was horrible. Just this massive thud, and then silence. The hog was dead instantly. I've been hunting my whole life, seen all kinds of kills, but this was different. This was calculated, efficient, almost human-like in its execution, but with strength that was just unreal. That's when it happened. Right after it killed the hog, while it was still holding the carcass, it looked directly up at my tree stand. Those eyes, it wasn't just seeing me, it was studying me. There was curiosity there, not aggression, but that almost made it worse. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't have taken a shot even if I'd wanted to. Then it did something that still haunts me. It let out this call. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream. It started low and rose in pitch, kind of like a siren, but organic, if that makes sense. And the worst part? Something answered it. From somewhere off to the east, maybe 200 or 300 yards away, came an almost identical call. I realized with absolute horror that there were at least two of these things out there. The female creature held eye contact with me for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10, 15 seconds. Then, in one fluid motion, it slung the dead hog over its shoulder like it weighed nothing and started walking away. The way it moved, it was bipedal, completely upright, but the gait was different from a human's. Longer stride, fluid motion. Its feet, which looked disturbingly human-like but much larger, left clear prints in the damp ground. The arms were longer than a human's, hanging down past its knees, and I could see muscles rippling under the fur as it carried that 200-pound hog like it was a grocery bag. I stayed in that tree for another 3 hours. I couldn't move. Physically could not make myself climb down. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped my water bottle at one point. I kept hearing movement in the woods, more of those calls back and forth, getting more distant. Finally, around 2 p.m., when I hadn't heard anything for over an hour, I climbed down. My legs were so weak I almost fell. I looked at the tracks and the scene where it had killed the hog. The prints were huge, easily 16, 17 inches long with 5 distinct toes. They were pressed deep into the soil. Whatever made them was incredibly heavy. There was blood on the tree where it had killed the hog, and the ground was torn up from the brief struggle. I took pictures with the disposable camera I had in my pack, but when I got them developed, they were too blurry to make out anything clearly. Story of my life, right? I went back the next day with a friend, but rain had washed away most of the tracks. Found some broken branches high up in the trees, way too high for a bear, and some weird hair caught on the bark that we couldn't identify. My friend said it looked like bear fur, but I know bear fur. This was different. I never went back to that spot again. Gave up hog hunting entirely, actually. I still hunt deer and elk, but never alone, and never from a tree stand. Some people have suggested it might have been a bear, or that I was seeing things, but I know what I saw. I've seen plenty of bears in my life. This was no bear. The intelligence in those eyes, the way it moved, the obvious hunting strategy it used. This was something else entirely. The thing that really gets me even now is that curious look it gave me. It wasn't afraid of me at all. It knew I was there the whole time, probably before I even got into that tree stand. It just didn't care. Like I wasn't a threat worth worrying about. And you know what? It was right. Against something like that, I wouldn't have stood a chance. I've read other people's encounters since then, trying to make sense of what I saw. Some details match up. The way the woods went silent, the weird calls, the reddish-brown fur. But I've never read about anyone else seeing one hunt like that. The calculated way it stalked those hogs, the brutal efficiency of the kill. It was almost professional, if that makes sense. That day changed how I see the woods, changed how I see the world, really. There are things out there we don't understand, things that shouldn't exist, but do. I don't talk about it much. My wife knows, and a couple close hunting buddies, but that's it. People look at you differently when you tell them you've seen something like this. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, when I'm out hunting and the woods go quiet, I wonder if they're out there, watching, hunting, waiting, and I wonder if next time they'll decide to do more than just look. Story 2. It was November 23rd, around 8:30 a.m., when I pulled into the ranger station. The morning was crisp, probably around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light fog hanging between the trees. The ranger, an older guy with grey hair and weathered skin, seemed distracted when I walked in to get my permit. While he was processing my paperwork, he kept glancing out the window. "There's been a bear active on the North Trail," he said, tapping his pen against the desk. "Big one, but it's not acting quite right." He paused, like he was choosing his words carefully. "Just keep your food secure and make plenty of noise." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. It wasn't the usual bear warning I'd heard countless times before. I started on the trail around 9:15 a.m. The plan was to hike about 8 miles that day, set up camp, then explore the area the next day before heading back on Sunday. The first couple of hours were uneventful, just me and the sound of my boots on the trail. But around noon, I noticed something that still bothers me when I think about it. The forest had gone completely silent. If you spend any time outdoors, you know there's always some ambient noise, birds, squirrels, wind in the trees. But this was different. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. I stopped walking and just listened. Nothing, not even the rustle of leaves. The air felt heavy, almost pressurized, like right before a massive storm. I decided to take a break and eat something, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. As I sat on a fallen log, I caught a whiff of something that made my stomach turn. It was like a combination of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I couldn't identify. The smell was strong enough to make my eyes water, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. By late afternoon, I'd covered about 7 miles and started looking for a campsite. I found a decent spot about 200 yards off the main trail, in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees. There was enough open space to set up my tent and still have good visibility of the surrounding area. Looking back, I realized that was probably what saved me. The sun set early, as it does in November, and by 5:30 p.m. it was already getting dark. I had my tent set up, food properly stored in a bear canister about 100 yards away, and was just finishing my dinner when I heard the first wood knock. If you've never heard one, it's like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree, a sharp, loud crack that echoes through the forest. It came from somewhere to the northeast, maybe 300 yards away. I've heard plenty of natural sounds in the wilderness, but this was different. It was deliberate. About 2 minutes later, another knock came from the opposite direction. Then another, closer this time. Whatever was making these sounds was surrounding my camp. My first thought was bears, but bears don't coordinate like that. They don't communicate with wood knocks. I quickly got into my tent, grabbed my flashlight and tried to stay calm. That's when the rocks started hitting my tent. Not big rocks, more like pebbles and pine cones, but they were definitely being thrown. They'd hit the tent fabric with a soft thud, one every few minutes from different directions. I sat absolutely still, trying to control my breathing, which seemed deafening in the silence. The attacks continued for what felt like hours, but my watch showed it was only about 45 minutes. Then came the footsteps, heavy, bipedal footsteps circling my tent. Whatever it was big. Each step made the ground vibrate slightly. The stride was too long to be human, and bears don't walk on 2 legs for that long. The footsteps would come close, pause, then move away, only to return from a different direction. Around 11 p.m., I heard something that still haunts my dreams. It started as a low grumble, almost subsonic, that I could feel in my chest. Then it built into what I can only describe as a scream, but not like any animal I've ever heard. It was too powerful, too intelligent sounding. It had modulation, like speech, but inhuman. The sound echoed off the mountains, and I heard answers from at least 2 other directions. I didn't sleep at all that night. The activity continued until about 4 a.m. Footsteps, occasional knocks, things hitting my tent. I had my knife in one hand and flashlight in the other the entire time. I never shined the light outside. Something told me that would make things worse. As soon as there was enough light to see, around 6:30 a.m., I packed up as quickly and quietly as I could. That's when I noticed them. Dozens of pine cones arranged in a perfect circle around my tent, about 15 feet in diameter. They hadn't been there the night before. Some were partially buried in the soil, placed with obvious purpose. I practically ran back to my car, covering the 7-mile return trip in just over 2 hours. I didn't stop once. The whole way back, I felt watched. The forest remained unnaturally quiet, and twice I heard wood knocks in the distance. When I got to the ranger station, it was closed. I left a note describing what happened, but I never heard back. I've tried researching similar incidents in that area, and while I've found a few reports that sound similar, nothing matches exactly what I experienced. The thing that stands out most in my memory isn't the sounds or even the footsteps, it's the intelligence behind it all. Whatever was out there was coordinating, communicating, and most disturbing of all, it was playing with me. Not hunting me, not trying to scare me away immediately, but deliberately toying with me throughout the night. I've been back to Yosemite many times since then, but never alone, and never to that particular area. I'm not saying I know what was out there that night, but I know what it wasn't. It wasn't a bear, wasn't wolves, wasn't mountain lions, and it definitely wasn't human. The incident fundamentally changed how I view the wilderness. There are things out there we don't understand, and sometimes not understanding is what keeps us alive. That arranged circle of pine cones still bothers me the most. It wasn't random animal behavior, it was a message. I just wish I knew what it meant. Story 3. I've been holding this story in for a long time, but I think I'm finally ready to share what happened to my wife Kathy and me back in '86. We were living in Chilliwack, BC at the time, and like most weekends that summer, we'd headed out to our usual fishing spot. It was mid-July, weather was perfect, not too hot, but warm enough to be comfortable. We had this little trailer we'd bought second-hand, nothing fancy, but it did the job. We'd set up at Harrison Lake, about 15 miles from town. There were maybe 5 or 6 other groups camping nearby, mostly regulars we'd seen before. It was around 4 p.m. when we'd finished our afternoon fishing. Had a pretty decent catch too, about 8 decent-sized rainbow trout. I remember being particularly proud of a 16-incher I'd caught. The way we usually did things was to clean the fish right away and hang them in a tree about 30 feet from our trailer. We had this rope system rigged up to keep them away from bears. At least that's what we were worried about at the time. Looking back now, I wish bears had been our only concern. The sun was starting to get lower, but it was still plenty bright out. Kathy was inside the trailer making coffee, and I was sitting in my favorite camp chair, just taking it easy after being on the lake all day. That's when the first weird thing happened. The birds just stopped. You know how the forest usually has this constant background noise? It all just died. At first I didn't think much of it, but then I noticed this smell. God, I'll never forget that smell. It was like something had died, but mixed with this musky, wet dog kind of stench. But worse, much worse. I called out to Kathy to come take a look, thinking maybe a bear was nearby. That's when we heard it. This heavy breathing sound like something big was trying to be quiet, but couldn't quite manage it. It came from the direction of our fish. The thing is, where we were camping, there was this gravel road that ran between our trailer and where we'd hung the fish. So we had a pretty clear line of sight. That's when we saw it. I've questioned myself 1,000 times since then, tried to convince myself it was something else, but I know what I saw. This creature just emerged from behind the trees where our fish were hanging. It was massive. I'm 6'1", and this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. The first thing that struck me was the color, this dark slate-gray fur covering its entire body. Not black like you usually hear in these stories, but definitely dark. The fur looked matted in some places, especially around its shoulders. It had our fish, just had them, clutched in one massive hand like they were nothing. The way it moved was what really got to me. It was so fluid, not clumsy or lumbering like you'd expect something that size to be. It was almost graceful, in a terrifying sort of way. Kathy was frozen beside me. I remember her coffee mug just slipped from her hand and shattered on the ground, but neither of us even flinched at the sound. The creature did, though. Its head snapped toward us so fast. Those eyes, they weren't animal eyes, not really. There was something else there, something that made my skin crawl. I'll never forget how it just stood there, staring at us. It couldn't have been more than 50 feet away, close enough that we could see its chest moving as it breathed, see the way the fur moved in the light breeze. I could see muscles rippling under that fur as it shifted its weight. The fish were dripping water onto its arm, but it didn't seem to notice or care. Then someone from one of the other campsites started yelling. I couldn't tell you what they were saying. It was like my brain couldn't process anything except what was right in front of me. The creature's head turned toward the sound, and then, without any apparent hurry, it just walked across the gravel road and into the forest on the other side. That's what stays with me the most. How casual it was. Like this was just a normal thing, grabbing someone's fish and walking off with them. No running, no aggression, just this purposeful walk. The way it moved through the trees was incredible. Despite its size, it seemed to just melt into the forest. As soon as it was gone, it was like someone had turned the volume back up. Birds started making noise again, and I could hear people from the other campsites shouting back and forth. A couple guys from the site next to ours came running over. They'd seen it too. One of them, Dave I think his name was, kept saying over and over, "Did you see that? Did you fucking see that?" We ended up staying there that night. Nobody really slept much. The next morning, this researcher showed up, Thomas Steenberg. Apparently someone had called him. He spent hours examining the area, taking photographs. The creature had left tracks across the gravel road and into the softer ground beyond. I watched as Steinberg measured them, 18 inches long, some of them. He made a cast of one of the clearest ones. I remember him counting. Said he found 112 distinct prints leading away from our campsite. The weird thing is, we didn't pack up and leave right away like you might expect. We stayed for 2 more days, though we didn't do any more fishing. It was like we needed to prove to ourselves that it had really happened, that we weren't crazy. The other campers who'd seen it stayed too. We all just sat around comparing notes, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. The smell lingered for hours after it was gone. Every now and then, when I'm out in the woods, I catch a whiff of something similar, and my heart just stops. Kathy won't go camping anymore. Can't say I blame her. I've spent years trying to rationalize what we saw that day. I've looked at pictures of bears standing on their hind legs, studied every large animal native to British Columbia. Nothing matches. Nothing comes close to explaining what took our fish that day. The most frustrating part is that none of us had cameras ready. It was 1986. People didn't carry phones with cameras back then, and our regular camera was packed away in the trailer. By the time anyone thought about getting a picture, it was long gone. All we have are those plaster casts Steinberg made and our memories. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story back then, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But I know what I saw. I know what Kathy saw, what the other campers saw. That thing was real, and it was nothing that's supposed to exist in those woods. Sometimes I drive past that spot when I'm headed up to Harrison Lake. I never stop there anymore, but I always slow down and look at those trees. The forest has changed a bit over the years, logging, new growth, but I can still pick out exactly where it happened. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, or if there are more of them. I don't really want to know the answer. The thing that really gets me, even after all these years, is how deliberate it all seemed. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. The way it looked at us, the way it moved, there was intelligence there. It knew exactly what it was doing. And somehow, that's the most unsettling part of all. Utsern. Story 4. I've been sitting on this experience for almost 9 years now, and honestly, I still get chills thinking about what happened to me on the West Rosebud Trail in Montana. I've practiced family law in Boston for over a decade, dealing with messy divorces and custody battles, so I'm used to stressful situations. But nothing in my professional life could have prepared me for what I encountered during that solo hike in July 2015. I needed to clear my head after a particularly rough case, and Montana seemed like the perfect escape from Boston's humidity and my overwhelming caseload. I'd done plenty of day hikes before, but this was my first multi-day solo trek. I'd researched the West Rosebud Trail extensively, packed all the necessary gear, and even splurged on some high-end camping equipment. Looking back, I probably over-prepared, but that's just how I am. Careful, methodical, always planning ahead. The morning started perfectly. July 15th, around 6:30 a.m. The weather was ideal. Clear skies, about 65 degrees with a light breeze. I'd gotten an early start to avoid other hikers and make the most of the daylight. The trail was everything I'd read about online. Pristine wilderness, stunning mountain views, and that crisp Montana air that makes you feel more alive with every breath. I'd been hiking for about 4 hours when things started feeling off. You know that sensation when you're alone in your house but suddenly feel like someone's watching you? It was like that, but amplified by the vastness of the wilderness. The birds that had been chirping all morning gradually went silent. At first I rationalized it. Maybe it was just the time of day, or perhaps a hawk was nearby. But something in my gut told me this was different. Around 11:30 a.m., I decided to set up camp in a small clearing about 50 feet from the main trail. It was earlier than planned, but I wanted to do some photography and explore the area without my full pack. I secured my tent, a North Face Stormbreak 2, nothing fancy but reliable, left my main pack inside with my food properly stored, and took just my camera, water and trail mix for a short exploration. I hadn't gone more than a quarter mile when I heard it, a sound I still can't properly explain. It wasn't quite a scream, not exactly a roar, but something in between, deep, guttural, but with an almost human quality that made my skin crawl. It echoed off the mountains, making it impossible to pinpoint the direction. My first thought was a bear, but I'd heard bear sounds before, and this was completely different. The logical part of my brain kicked in. I needed to get back to camp, grab my bear spray, and assess the situation. But when I returned about 15 minutes later, what I saw made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. My tent was gone. Not collapsed, not blown over. Gone. It took me a few seconds of confused scanning before I spotted it about 20 feet up in a lodgepole pine, wrapped around the trunk like it had been thrown there with incredible force. My backpack was on the ground, literally ripped in half, with my belongings scattered in a 30-foot radius. The bizarre thing was my food bag, which had been properly stored in an odor-proof container, was untouched, still sealed, just tossed aside. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate my phone to check if I had service. I didn't. As I was frantically gathering what I could salvage of my supplies, I heard something moving through the forest behind me. Not the normal sound of wildlife. This was bipedal, heavy footsteps crushing underbrush with deliberate movement. Then I heard what I can only describe as voices, but not quite human voices. It was like someone trying to mimic human speech without understanding it. Deep, resonant sounds that had the cadence of conversation but made no sense. They seemed to be coming from multiple directions, as if whatever was making them was circling my position. That's when I saw it. About 100 yards up the slope to my right, moving between the trees, was a figure that I still struggle to describe. It was huge. I'm 6'1", and this thing had at least 2 feet on me, maybe more. The muscle mass was incredible, visible even at that distance, covered in dark hair. But what really got me was the speed. This thing moved uphill faster than I could run on flat ground, weaving between trees with impossible agility for its size. I didn't stick around to see more. I grabbed what I could, my phone, wallet, some water, and my car keys, stuffed them in my camera bag, and started moving as fast as I safely could, back toward the trailhead. The whole time, those voices followed me, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. Occasionally, I'd hear heavy movement in the forest parallel to the trail, but I forced myself not to look. I just focused on moving forward. The most unnerving part was the intelligence behind it all. This wasn't some animal reacting on instinct. The way my camp had been dismantled, the positioning of the voices, the way it seemed to shepherd me back down the trail. It felt calculated, territorial. I made it back to my car around 4:30 p.m., covering what should have been a 5-hour hike in just under 3 hours. My legs were cramping, I was dehydrated, and I had tears in my eyes from pure stress. But I was alive. Here's what really haunts me. When I finally got cell service and called the rangers to report what happened, they told me there had been 3 other similar incidents in that area over the past month. Camps destroyed, hikers reporting strange voices, and one guy who swore he saw something matching my description moving at impossible speeds through the trees. They searched the area but only found my shredded gear and tent, which they photographed for their report. No tracks, no hair samples, nothing conclusive. I've tried to rationalize it countless times since then. Maybe it was some elaborate prank. Maybe I was suffering from altitude sickness or dehydration. But those voices, that figure, the sheer intelligence behind the whole encounter, I can't explain it away. The rangers never found any evidence of bears or other wildlife that could account for what happened to my campsite. I still hike, but never alone, and never in that part of Montana. My friends think I'm paranoid because I won't do solo trips anymore, but they weren't there. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't hear those voices. I'm sharing this now because I recently read about another incident in the same area, and the details were eerily similar to what I experienced. Maybe someone else out there has seen the same thing. Maybe there's an explanation I haven't considered. All I know is that something intelligent and powerful lives in those woods, something that doesn't want us there, and it's better at staying hidden than we are at finding it. The thing that really gets me even now is how deliberate it all felt. This wasn't just a random animal encounter. Whatever I encountered that day, it wanted me to leave its territory, and it made sure I got that message without causing me physical harm. It was calculated, intelligent, and far more powerful than anything I'd care to meet again. I still practice law in Boston, still handle divorces and custody battles. But now, when clients tell me they're going through the scariest time of their lives, I just nod and smile. They have no idea what real fear feels like. Real fear is standing in the Montana wilderness, realizing you're being hunted by something that shouldn't exist, something that's playing with you like a cat plays with a mouse. If you're planning a hike on the West Rosebud Trail, do yourself a favor. Don't go alone, and maybe stick to the more populated areas. Some parts of the wilderness should stay wild, and some questions are better left unanswered. Story 5. My wife Sarah and I are experienced backpackers. We've done the JMT twice and regularly do weekend trips in the Sierras. We're not newbies who panic at every sound in the woods. We know what bears sound and smell like. We know how to handle ourselves in the backcountry. But what happened that night at Thousand Island Lake was something entirely different. It was March 15th, 2024. We'd planned this early season trip for months, watching the weather like hawks. There had been an unusually warm spell, and while there was still plenty of snow at 10,000 feet, the forecast showed clear skies and temperatures in the high 30s, totally manageable with our winter gear. We'd done winter camping before, and the solitude of off-season hiking is something we really enjoy. The hike in was gorgeous, that crystal-clear Sierra air, snow-capped Banner Peak reflecting in partially frozen lakes, and absolutely nobody else around. We reached Thousand Island Lake around 2 p.m. and found a good spot to set up camp, about 50 yards from the shoreline, with some wind protection from a stand of whitebark pines. The lake was partially frozen, with open water in the middle and ice around the edges. We set up our tent, got our bear canister situated about 200 feet away, standard procedure, and spent the afternoon taking photos and soaking in the views. Everything felt normal until sunset. Usually in the Sierras, you'll hear Clark's nutcrackers calling, maybe some chickarees chattering, but as the sun started going down, there was this absence of sound. I've experienced the whole woods going quiet thing before when there's a predator around, but this was different. It felt heavier somehow. Sarah noticed it too. She kept looking over her shoulder while we were cooking dinner. We turned in around 8 p.m., pretty standard for winter camping when it gets dark early. The temperature had dropped to about 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and we were cozy in our winter sleeping bags. I remember checking my watch. It was 11:42 p.m. when the first sound woke us up. It started with what sounded like something moving around our bear canister. Not unusual in bear country, right? We've had bears mess with our canisters before, but the sounds were aggressive. Not the usual bear investigating a potential food source. It sounded like something was absolutely pissed off at the canister. There were these violent impacts, like something massive was picking it up and throwing it against rocks. I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out with my headlamp, but the canister was just at the edge of where the light reached effectively. The moon was nearly full, but there were clouds moving in and out, making visibility inconsistent. What really got to me was that despite the incredible racket, I couldn't actually see anything moving around the canister. That's when the footsteps started. I've heard bear footsteps in snow before. These were different, much heavier, with a distinct two-legged gait. They were coming from the direction of the bear canister, moving parallel to the shoreline. The snow dampened the sound somewhat, but you could feel the impact through the ground. Sarah grabbed my arm so tight it left marks. Then the smell hit us. Everyone talks about the smell in these situations, and I always thought it was exaggerated. It wasn't. Imagine roadkill that's been baking in the sun, mixed with wet dog and something musky and wild. It was so strong it felt like it was coating the inside of my nose. The footsteps circled our campsite, not right next to the tent, but maybe 30, 40 yards out, making a complete circuit. Whatever it was checking us out. I know this sounds crazy, but it felt methodical, deliberate, not like an animal just wandering through. We were absolutely still, not even whispering, just holding each other and trying to breathe as quietly as possible. The clouds had cleared for a moment, and the moonlight was casting shadows through the trees. That's when we saw it, not clearly but enough. A massive shadow moved between two trees about 40 yards from our tent. The trees were good-sized white bark pines, and this thing, it was broader than the tree trunks and at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It moved with this smooth, rolling gait that was unmistakably bipedal. The footsteps continued around our camp, and then we heard it moving away toward the lake. What happened next is something I'll never forget. From across the lake, maybe half a mile away, came this sound that I can only describe as a cross between a whale song and thunder. It was this deep, resonant call that seemed to go on forever. The thing near our camp immediately responded with a similar call, and then took off in that direction at an incredible speed. The sound of it moving through the snow and breaking branches as it ran was terrifying, not because it was chaotic, but because of how powerfully and efficiently it moved. This wasn't a lumbering animal crashing through the woods. The rhythm of its movement was almost athletic. We didn't sleep a wink for the rest of the night. We just sat there, holding each other, listening to occasional sounds from across the lake. Wood knocking, more of those calls, but more distant. As soon as there was enough light to see, we carefully unzipped the tent and looked outside. The bear canister hadn't moved an inch. It was still sitting exactly where we'd left it, completely untouched. But all around it, and circling our entire campsite, were tracks in the snow. They were roughly 16 inches long and 8 inches wide, with 5 distinct toes. The stride length was over 6 feet in some places. I took photos, but honestly, they don't do justice to how shocking it was to see them in person. What really gets me is the precision of its movement. The tracks showed it had walked in a perfect circle around our camp, keeping exactly the same distance from our tent the entire time. This wasn't random animal behavior, it was intentional. We packed up faster than we ever have before and got out of there. The whole hike out, we kept hearing wood knocks in the distance, always behind us, always just at the edge of where we could hear. They stopped once we got within a couple miles of the trailhead. I've spent months trying to rationalize this. I've gone over every possible explanation. Bears don't walk on 2 legs for extended periods. They don't make those sounds. They don't move with that kind of precision. Mountain lions, wolves, nothing native to the Sierras fits what we experienced. We haven't gone winter camping since then. Sarah still backpacks with me, but she refuses to do off-season trips now. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear those calls, that deep, resonant sound that felt like it was coming from something that had no business existing in our modern world. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I know how it sounds, but I know what we experienced. And I know those tracks weren't made by any recognized animal in the Sierra Nevada. The intentionality of it all, the circling, the communication, the way it seemed to be studying us, that's what keeps me up at night. Whatever it was. It wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. It knew exactly what it was doing. The rangers we reported it to just logged it as a possible bear encounter, but the look one of them gave me when I described the footprints, I could tell she'd heard similar stories before. She just couldn't officially acknowledge it. I've never believed in the supernatural, and I still don't. But I'm convinced there's something out there in the Sierras that we don't have a scientific explanation for yet. Something intelligent. Something that's managed to stay hidden despite all our technology and exploration. Something that really doesn't want to be found, but occasionally lets us know it's there. I still backpack in the Sierras, but I'm much more alert now. Every time I hear wood knocks in the distance or catch an unusual scent on the wind, I wonder if it's watching. The really unsettling thing is, I'm pretty sure it always has been. We're just usually not quiet enough or still enough to notice. Story 6. It was early July, and our parents had signed us up for a 2-week summer camp run by the Methodist Church. The camp was pretty remote, set high up in Grand Mesa, Colorado, surrounded by dense forest and rocky terrain. We'd been to church camps before, but this one was different from the start. The facilities were older, a main lodge, 3 dormitory cabins, and a few smaller buildings scattered around a clearing. Everything was made of weathered wood that had seen better days. The first few days were normal enough, typical camp activities like hiking, crafts, and evening prayers. There were about 30 kids total, ranging from 10 to 15 years old, plus 6 counselors and the camp director, Mr. Peterson. Looking back, I remember the counselors being really young, probably college students doing summer work. 2 of them, Jenny and Tom, seemed to be dating, though they tried to hide it. The weird stuff started on our 4th night there. I was having trouble sleeping, the altitude was still getting to me, when I heard this sound that I still can't properly describe. It wasn't quite a howl, but it wasn't a screech either. It was deep and resonant, like it was coming from something massive, but with this almost human quality that made my skin crawl. It echoed across the valley, and I noticed how everything else went dead silent. No crickets, no night birds, nothing. Mike was in the bunk below me, and I heard him whisper, "Did you hear that?" Before I could answer, something hit the roof. Not like a branch falling. This was deliberate. Something heavy was thrown and landed with a thud, then rolled down the angled roof and fell to the ground. A few other kids woke up, and one of the younger ones started crying. Mr. Peterson came in with a flashlight to check on us, saying it was probably just a raccoon, but I could tell by his face he didn't believe that. The next day, we found a large branch near where we'd heard the object fall. But here's the thing. It wasn't broken or torn like it had fallen naturally. The end was twisted off, like something had deliberately snapped it. The break was fresh, and the branch was from high up, way higher than any person could reach. Mr. Peterson told us not to worry about it, but he spent a long time on the radio that morning, talking to someone in hushed tones. That night, the same thing happened again, but worse. The sound started earlier, right after lights out. Multiple howls, some closer than others, like they were calling to each other. Then the throwing started, not just branches this time. Rocks were hitting the roof too. Some of the younger kids were terrified, and the counselors moved everyone into the main lodge, saying it was for a special late-night devotional. But I could see them boarding up the windows. I couldn't sleep, so I was watching through a gap in the boards when I saw Jenny and Tom sneaking out around midnight. They headed toward the lake trail, probably thinking everyone was asleep. About 20 minutes later, we heard the screaming. It wasn't like movie screaming. This was pure terror. Everyone woke up instantly. Mr. Peterson and 2 other counselors grabbed flashlights and the camp's only rifle. They ordered us to stay put and ran toward the screams. I pulled Mike to the window with me, and what we saw next has haunted me for decades. Jenny and Tom were running full sprint back toward the lodge. Behind them, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move, was this massive dark figure. In the darkness I couldn't make out details, but I could see its outline against the tree line. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, and incredibly broad. The way it moved was both human-like and not, taking huge strides but with this fluid, athletic motion that seemed impossible for its size. The counselor's flashlight beams caught it for just a second, and that's when I saw its eyes. They reflected the light like a cat's eyes, but they were huge and set in this massive head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, no neck visible. The light also caught its fur, dark brown or black, but with this weird silvery sheen in places. What really got me was how the fur moved, not like fur on a bear, but almost like long human hair. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing when the flashlights hit it. Jenny and Tom made it to the lodge, and Mr. Peterson fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the valley, and for a moment, everything was absolutely still. Then we heard it. Not a roar or a howl, but this deep, resonant sound that was almost like laughter. It turned and moved back into the trees, but not like it was scared, more like it was choosing to leave. The next few hours were chaos. Jenny was hysterical, talking about how they'd been followed, how they'd heard something massive moving through the woods around them for several minutes before it showed itself. Tom had scratches down his back from running through branches, but he kept saying they were lucky, that the thing had been playing with them, that it could have caught them easily if it wanted to. Mr. Peterson was on the radio all night. The next morning, parents started showing up to pick kids up early. They told us there had been a safety concern and that the camp session was ending early. Mike and I overheard one of the counselors saying that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened, that there had been incidents in previous years, but never this aggressive. We later found out that the camp never opened again after that summer. The official story was that the facilities needed too many repairs to be worth maintaining, but I know better. I've kept track over the years. There have been other sightings in that area, though none quite as dramatic as what we experienced. The smell. I almost forgot to mention the smell. During the whole incident, there was this powerful, musky odor, like wet fur, and something else I can't describe. For weeks afterward, I'd wake up at night thinking I could smell it again. I've spent a lot of time trying to rationalize what happened that night. Bears don't throw things at buildings. Mountain lions don't laugh. Nothing natural in those woods could move the way that thing moved, or make the sounds we heard. Mike and I have talked about it over the years, making sure we're remembering the same things, that we haven't embellished or imagined details. If anything, we've probably blocked out some of the scarier parts. I've never gone camping again. Mike became kind of obsessed with it for a while, reading everything he could find about similar encounters in Colorado. He even tried to go back to Grand Mesa a few years later, but found the old campsite completely demolished, just concrete foundations remaining. The thing that still gets me, all these years later, is the intelligence we witnessed. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct, the way it terrorized us for days, the way it chose to reveal itself, how it seemed to be toying with Jenny and Tom. There was purpose behind its actions. It was smart, and that's what scares me the most. I'm sharing this now because I recently heard about some similar incidents in that same area. Same pattern, strange sounds, things being thrown, that distinctive smell. Part of me hopes someone else who was there that summer will read this and corroborate what happened. The rest of me hopes I never have to think about it again. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night and everything is quiet, I still hear that sound, that deep, resonant, almost laugh, echoing in my memory. And I wonder if somewhere up in Grand Mesa, that thing is still there, still watching, still waiting for someone else to wander into its territory. Story 7. I spent 32 years as a mail carrier in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, and after retiring, my wife and I moved to a quiet 5-acre property just outside town. It was the perfect spot, mostly wooded, with a small creek running through the back of the property. Just what we wanted for our retirement. But what happened that October changed everything about how I see these woods. It started on October 12, 1997. I remember the date clearly because it was the day after my grandson's birthday party. I was out cutting firewood for the winter, something I did every fall to stock up. The weather was perfect that day, around 65 degrees, with that crisp autumn feel in the air. I'd been at it since about 3 p.m., and it was getting close to dusk, maybe around 6:30. I've spent enough time in these woods to know how they sound. You get used to the background noise, birds, squirrels, the creek bubbling about 50 yards behind the house, but that evening, something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on what was wrong. Then it hit me. Everything had gone completely silent. Not the natural quiet of evening settling in, but an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I was stacking the last of the wood in my shed when I noticed it. The silence was so complete, I could hear my own breathing. Even the creek seemed muted. My old Labrador Jake, who usually follows me around while I work, was nowhere to be seen. That wasn't like him at all. Something made me walk toward the creek. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was stupid, but I had this overwhelming feeling that I needed to check it out. There's a small clearing near the water where deer often come to drink. The ground there stays pretty muddy, and I'd often see tracks in the morning. What I found stopped me dead in my tracks. There in the mud were footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen. I've tracked deer, bears, and all sorts of wildlife in these woods for decades. These prints were human-like, but massive, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The impression in the mud was deep, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. They were fresh too, the edges still sharp in the dying light. I ran back to the house and grabbed my flashlight and camera. By the time I returned, it was almost dark, but I managed to take a few photos. The prints led along the creek for about 30 yards before disappearing into the thick brush. I didn't dare follow them further in the dark. That night, something changed around our property. Jake and our other dog, a German shepherd named Max, refused to leave the porch after sunset. These were outdoor dogs who loved patrolling the property, but now they'd whine and scratch at the door to come inside as soon as it got dark. The next morning, I found our metal trash cans knocked over, garbage strewn everywhere. At first I thought it was bears. We get them occasionally. But when I looked closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were distinct finger marks pressed into the metal of the can, like something with enormous hands had gripped it. The indentations were deep, like someone had squeezed the metal like it was clay. This happened 2 more nights in a row. Each morning, same thing, trash cans destroyed and those huge finger marks. The dogs wouldn't stop barking at night, but they wouldn't leave the porch. My wife thought I was crazy, but I knew something was out there. I'm not a guy who scares easily. 32 years of delivering mail in all conditions teaches you to handle yourself. But this was different. There was something calculating about it. Whatever was doing this wasn't just randomly foraging. It was coming back to the same place at the same time, night after night. After the 3rd night, I decided to set up my trail camera. I had it from deer hunting, one of those motion-activated ones. I mounted it on a tree overlooking where I kept the trash cans, about 12 feet up so bears couldn't reach it. 2 nights later, at 3:47 a.m., it captured something that still chills me to this day. The image was dark, but clear enough to make out a massive figure hunched over our trash cans. It was hard to get an exact size from the angle, but comparing it to the cans, which are about 3 feet tall, this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. It wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong. It had long arms, a distinct head, and was covered in what looked like dark fur. The way it was moving was what really got to me. It wasn't just randomly pawing through the trash. Its movements were deliberate, almost human-like. In one frame, you can clearly see it picking up a can with both hands, examining it before turning it over. The intelligence in those actions scared me more than its size. I showed the photos to my wife, and for the first time she believed me. We decided to install motion sensor lights around the property the next day. I put up 6 of them, making sure they covered all approaches to the house and especially the area around the trash cans. That's when things got even stranger. The visit stopped, completely. No more knocked-over trash cans, no more prints by the creek, nothing. It was like whatever it was knew we were watching for it and decided to move on. The dogs gradually returned to their normal behavior, but they still get agitated sometimes at night, staring into the darkness at something we can't see. I've struggled with whether to share this story. Most people would probably think I'm crazy or making it up, but I know what I saw. Those footprints were real, the dents in our trash cans were real, and that figure in the trail cam photo, that was definitely real. What bothers me most isn't just what I saw, but how intelligent it seemed. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. Whatever visited our property those nights showed purpose, showed adaptation, and when the situation changed, it changed its behavior. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear unusual sounds from the woods, deep, resonant whoops that don't sound like any animal I know. And occasionally, very occasionally, I'll find those same massive footprints down by the creek. I kept the trail cam photos and took measurements of everything. The footprints, the finger marks on the cans, everything. I've thought about sharing them online, but honestly, I'm not sure I want the attention that might bring. My wife and I still live on the same property. Whatever it was never showed any aggression toward us, and I'd like to keep it that way. The locals around here have stories, of course, tales of something big living in the deeper parts of the Ozarks. I used to think they were just stories. Now I'm not so sure. All I know is that something intelligent enough to understand when it was being watched, strong enough to dent metal with its bare hands, and big enough to leave 16-inch footprints visited my property for those few nights in October 1997. And sometimes, when I'm out splitting wood and the woods go quiet, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching. Story 8. It started in late August. At first we noticed something odd in the cornfields. long, straight paths where the corn had been pushed down or broken. Now we'd dealt with deer damage before, but this was different. These weren't random trails. They were perfect corridors, about 6 feet wide, running straight through sections of our field. Dad thought maybe some local kids were messing around, but the damage was too extensive, and something about it just felt wrong. The first time I saw it, I was doing a night harvest run. It was around 2 a.m. on September 12th. I remember the date clearly because it was just 2 days after my sister's birthday. The air was unusually cold for September, probably in the low 50s, and there was this thin layer of fog hanging just above the corn. I was in our John Deere combine, lights blazing, making my way through the northeastern section of the field, about half a mile from the house. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. You know that feeling when you just know something's watching you? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. I'd been farming all my life, spent countless nights in those fields, but this felt different. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, distant coyotes, the rustle of corn in the breeze, they all just stopped. I slowed the combine down, scanning the field ahead with the headlights. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, standing in one of those mysterious corridors we'd found, was something that shouldn't exist. The lights caught it full on, a massive hair-covered figure, easily 8 feet tall. It was reaching up, actually pulling corn off the stalks and eating it. The fur was this dark brown color, but with a weird reddish tint where the lights hit it. Its arms were impossibly long, hanging almost to its knees. My whole body went cold. The combine's engine was running, but somehow I could hear it breaking the corn stalks, this weird, deliberate snapping sound. It moved with purpose, like it knew exactly what it was doing. When it turned slightly, I caught a glimpse of its profile. A sloped forehead, prominent brow, no neck to speak of. It looked powerful, muscular, but not like any animal I'd ever seen. I must have sat there frozen for maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. Then it turned its head toward the combine's lights. I'll never forget those eyes catching the light. They reflected back this deep, reddish amber color. That's when I lost it. I threw the combine into reverse so fast I nearly stalled it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. I backed up about 100 yards before turning around and heading straight back to the barn. I didn't even finish the row. When I got back, I sat in the cab for maybe 15 minutes, trying to stop shaking and figure out if I'd actually seen what I thought I saw. I didn't tell my dad that night. How could I? It sounded crazy even in my own head. But 2 nights later, he saw it too. He was checking the irrigation system around 10 p.m. when he came face to face with it in almost the same spot. He came running back to the house, white as a sheet. That's when we finally talked about what we'd seen. The next day, we found the tracks. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there they were, footprints, clear as day, about 18 inches long. They were human-like but massive, with 5 distinct toes and this weird double-ball print that no human foot would make. We took pictures, measured them, even made some plaster casts. The stride length was incredible, nearly 6 feet between prints. We installed electric fencing around the most affected areas, thinking it might help. It didn't. Whatever this thing was, it was smart. It started avoiding the fenced areas but would create new paths in other parts of the field. We'd find broken stalks every morning, always in those same straight corridors. The smell was another thing we noticed. Some mornings, especially around the damaged areas, there was this powerful, musky odor, not like anything dead or rotting, but strong and wild, like wet dog mixed with something else I can't even describe. It would make your eyes water if you got too close. Word got around town, and some researchers showed up about a week later. They collected hair samples from the electric fence, coarse, dark strands that they said didn't match any known wildlife in the area. They set up game cameras too, but we never caught anything clear on them. Just some blurry movement and more broken corn. The encounters continued for about 3 weeks. Sometimes we'd hear strange vocalizations at night. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something in between that would echo across the fields. The local dogs would go crazy whenever they heard it. Our German shepherd, Max, who'd never been afraid of anything in his life, refused to go near the cornfield after dark. The last encounter was the strangest. It was October 3rd, just before dawn. I was getting ready to start the morning harvest when I heard this powerful rhythmic thumping sound coming from the field. It was like something was hitting the ground or the corn stalks with tremendous force. When I went to investigate, from a safe distance with my rifle, I found an area where several corn stalks had been woven together into this weird arch shape about 7 feet high. The corn around it was all pushed down in a perfect circle, maybe 30 feet in diameter. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. No more tracks, no more damaged corn, no more strange sounds. It was like whatever had been visiting our farm just moved on. The researchers came back a few more times, took more samples, asked more questions, but we never got any real answers. Even now, 21 years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, remembering those eyes reflecting in my combine's headlights. We still farm that land, but I never do night harvests alone anymore. The corridors it made are long gone, the tracks washed away by years of rain and snow, but sometimes in the fall, when the corn is high and the fog rolls in at night, I swear I can still smell that strange, musky odor on the breeze. I've read about other sightings in Michigan, some not far from our farm, but I've never shared our story publicly until now. I know how it sounds. Believe me, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. But I know what I saw that night, what my father saw, what visited our farm that fall. Whatever it was real, it was intelligent, and it changed how I see the world forever. Some of our neighbors suggested maybe it was a bear or someone in a suit playing pranks, but I've seen bears. Bears don't make methodical paths through cornfields. They don't weave corn stalks into structures, and no person in a suit could have left those tracks or reached those heights. The researchers who came to our farm took their samples and data, but we never heard what became of their findings. Maybe they didn't find anything conclusive, or maybe they found something they couldn't explain. I still have those plaster casts of the footprints stored in our barn, along with the photographs we took. Sometimes I look at them, just to remind myself that it wasn't all in my head. The pictures don't do justice to what we experienced, but they're proof enough for me that something extraordinary happened on our farm that fall. I don't expect everyone to believe this story, and honestly, I'm not sure I would believe it myself if someone else told it to me. But I know what I saw, what my family experienced, and how it affected us. These days I keep a much closer eye on the cornfields at night, and I never dismiss the stories I hear about strange sightings in rural Michigan. Because now I know, sometimes the unbelievable is real, and sometimes it walks through your cornfield in the middle of the night, leaving only mysteries behind. Story 9. I've been working at the anthracite coal mine in Pine Grove for nearly 15 years, but what happened during that week in October 2012 still keeps me up at night. I'm not the kind of person who believes in monsters or fairy tales. I'm just a regular guy who operates heavy machinery for a living. But what my crew and I encountered that week, well, I still can't explain it. It started during our night shift on October 3rd. The weather had been unusually cold for early October, with temperatures dropping into the low 40s after sunset. Our crew of 6 was working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift at the eastern section of the mine, about 2 miles from the main facility. This area had been partially abandoned after the company decided to focus operations elsewhere, but we still needed to maintain some equipment there and run regular inspections. Around 2 a.m., I was operating the front-end loader while Mike and Steve were checking some old containers we used for storing spare parts. The area was dimly lit by our work lights and the loader's headlights, creating these weird shadows between the equipment and the tree line about 50 yards away. The rest of the guys were further down, marking areas for the day shift. I first noticed something was off when I couldn't hear any of the usual nighttime sounds. No crickets, no owls, nothing. It was that kind of silence that makes the hair on your neck stand up. I remember thinking it was strange because we usually had all sorts of wildlife around, even with our machinery running. Then I saw it. At first I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on my eyes. Between 2 abandoned containers about 40 yards away, there was this massive dark figure. I'm not talking about regular human-sized massive. This thing had to be at least 9 feet tall. The security lights from behind it created this silhouette, and I could clearly see it was covered in thick, dark hair. The shoulders were incredibly wide, probably twice the width of our biggest guy, and its arms seemed unusually long. I froze. My hands were still on the loader's controls, but I couldn't move. The creature was just standing there, perfectly still, watching us. I could feel its eyes on us, even though I couldn't make out its face clearly in the darkness. The only way I can describe it is like when you know someone's staring at you from across a room. That kind of instinctive feeling. I finally snapped out of it and grabbed my radio to call Mike and Steve. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. "Guys," I whispered into the radio, "slowly turn around and look between the containers near the old cat, 336. I tried to keep my voice steady, but they could probably hear the fear in it. I watched as they both turned and immediately went rigid. The creature must have noticed their movement because it shifted its position slightly, and that's when we heard it. This deep, guttural breathing sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't anything I'd ever heard before either. Steve started slowly backing up toward my loader. That's when the creature moved. It didn't run or charge. It just took these enormous fluid steps backward into the tree line. The way it moved was unlike anything I've ever seen. Despite its size, it was incredibly smooth and quiet. One second it was there, and the next it had disappeared into the darkness, barely disturbing any branches. We immediately called the rest of the crew on the radio and told them to get back to our location. Nobody wanted to split up after that. We finished our shift staying close together, constantly looking over our shoulders. The weird thing was, we could still feel its presence. Every now and then, we'd catch glimpses of movement in the darkness or hear strange rustling sounds from different directions. The next morning, we reported it to our supervisor, Jim. He's been in mining for 30 years and usually brushes off any safety concerns that don't involve actual mining hazards. But when we took him to check out the area in daylight, his face went white. There were these massive footprints in the mud near the containers, easily 16 inches long and incredibly deep, like whatever made them was extremely heavy. But what really got to him were the containers themselves. These steel containers had deep scratch marks on them, the kind that would take incredible strength to make in metal that thick. Jim told us not to talk about it and took some photos of the prints and scratch marks. He said he needed to document it for safety purposes. We continued working that week, but only during day shifts, and never alone. Every day we'd find new evidence, more footprints in different areas, strange hair caught on the fence, which Jim collected, and this horrible musky smell that would come and go. The final straw came 5 days later. Jim was doing a night inspection with the security team, something about checking if kids were sneaking onto the property. He had his camera with him because he'd been documenting all the strange things we'd been finding. Around 10 p.m., they had one of the mining trucks parked near the tree line, with its lights pointing into the woods while they checked the perimeter fence. That's when they saw it in full view. Jim managed to take a photo before his camera stopped working. He showed it to us the next day, and even though the creature was partially hidden by shadows, you could clearly see its massive frame illuminated by the truck's headlights. The photo showed something that looked almost human in its posture, but was clearly not human at all. The proportions were all wrong, too tall, too wide, and covered in thick, dark hair. The company shut down that section of the mine the very next day. They claimed it was due to structural safety concerns, but they put up new fencing and no trespassing signs everywhere within 48 hours. They also brought in some kind of private security team that patrolled the area 24/7 for the next few weeks. I still work at the mine, but we never go to that eastern section anymore. The company transferred all the usable equipment out of there and just left the containers. Sometimes, when I'm working the day shift and look in that direction, I swear I can see something moving between the trees watching us. Most of the guys who were there that week have transferred to different sites or taken other jobs. Jim retired early 6 months later. I've never been a believer in the paranormal or cryptids or whatever you want to call them. I'm still not sure what we saw that week. But I know what I saw wasn't human, and those footprints and claw marks weren't made by any bear or known animal. The photo Jim took disappeared along with all his other documentation when the company stepped in. I still have trouble sleeping some nights, especially when I hear about other sightings in the area. A few hunters have reported similar experiences in the state forest near the mine, but nobody's gotten clear evidence. The company still maintains that section is off-limits, and now there are rumors they're planning to permanently seal it off with concrete barriers. Whatever it was, it's still out there. And every time I start my shift, I catch myself looking toward those trees, hoping I never have another encounter like that again. Story 10. What happened to me in the woods near Concrete, Washington back in 2008 completely changed how I view the wilderness. And honestly, it's changed how I view what's possible in our world. I've been a wildlife photographer for over 15 years, specializing in birds of prey, particularly eagles. I've spent countless nights alone in the wilderness, but nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced during that spring morning in the North Cascades. It was early April, and I'd gotten a tip about a nesting pair of bald eagles in a remote area about 12 miles east of Concrete. The location was perfect, far enough from civilization to catch truly natural behavior, but still accessible enough that I could hike in with my gear. I packed my usual kit, Canon EOS 1D Mark III with my trusty 500mm lens, a smaller backup camera, camping supplies, and enough food for 3 days. The weather forecast showed clear skies, ideal conditions for the kind of shots I was after. I hiked in on Tuesday afternoon, following old logging roads for the first few miles before switching to game trails. The area was heavily forested, mostly old-growth Douglas firs and western red cedars. I found a decent camping spot about half a mile from where I'd spotted the eagle's nest through my binoculars, far enough not to disturb them, but close enough for pre-dawn positioning. The first thing that struck me as odd was the silence. I've spent enough time in these woods to know their rhythm. There's always some ambient noise, whether it's birds, small animals, or just wind in the trees. But as I set up my tent, I noticed periods of complete silence that would last for several minutes. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off, focusing instead on getting my camp organized and planning my shot locations for the morning. I woke up at 4:30 a.m. on Wednesday, grabbed my main camera gear, and headed toward my pre-scouted location. The pre-dawn light was perfect, that soft bluish glow that wildlife photographers dream about. I spent about 3 hours getting some decent shots of the eagles. Around 8 a.m., I decided to head back to camp for breakfast and to change memory cards. That's when everything changed. As I approached my campsite, I immediately knew something was wrong. Even from 50 yards away, I could see my tent wasn't right. It was completely flattened, like something had walked right over it. My heart started racing. I'd encountered bears before, but this was different. The destruction seemed deliberate. My tent was shredded, but not in the way a bear would do it looking for food. It was like something had methodically pulled it apart, examining its contents. What really got to me was how my belongings were scattered. Not in a chaotic way, but almost in a pattern, spread out in a rough circle around where the tent had been. My sleeping bag was about 40 yards away, hanging from a branch about 8 feet off the ground. My food bag, which I'd properly hung in a tree the night before, was gone. I found its contents scattered in a 50-yard radius, but the bag itself was missing. Then I saw the tracks. I've tracked plenty of wildlife over the years. I know what bear tracks look like, what cougar prints look like. These were nothing like that. They were clearly bipedal, but massive, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length was incredible, probably close to 6 feet. They led from my destroyed campsite into a particularly dense stand of trees. My hands were shaking as I took photos of the prints with my backup camera. The soil was perfect for tracks, slightly damp from morning dew, but firm enough to hold detail. You could see distinct toe impressions and what looked like dermal ridges, skin texture basically. These weren't just impressions, they were detailed casts of something's foot. That's when I heard it, a deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear's growl or an elk's bugle. It was almost human-like, but deeper than any human could produce, and it had this weird modulation to it, almost like speech, but not quite. I'm not ashamed to admit I panicked. I grabbed what I could, mainly my cameras and some water, and started making my way back toward the logging road. That's when the following began. I never saw it clearly, but I knew something was pacing me through the woods. Every few minutes, I'd hear branches breaking or that deep vocalization, always off to my left, always just far enough in the trees that I couldn't get a clear look. But occasionally, through gaps in the vegetation, I'd catch glimpses of something large and dark moving parallel to my path. My wildlife photography instincts kicked in, and I started taking pictures whenever I heard movement. Most of them came out useless, just blurry shots of trees, but three of them show something. In one, you can make out what looks like a massive hair-covered shoulder moving behind a tree. In another, there's a distinct outline of a head, not a bear's head, but something with a more human-like profile, though much larger. The third shows a hand or foot grabbing a tree trunk, and you can clearly see opposable digits. The following lasted for about 2 hours. Whatever it was, it seemed to be herding me, keeping me moving in a specific direction. Any time I tried to veer right toward the more open terrain, there would be a massive crash from the woods to my left, pushing me back on course. At one point, I decided to stop and try to get a better look at what was following me. That turned out to be a mistake. As soon as I stopped moving, the woods went completely silent. That unnatural silence from the night before. Then came the smell, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation, so strong it made my eyes water. Something large moved in the trees about 40 yards away, and I heard what I can only describe as breathing. Heavy, rhythmic breathing that sounded like it was coming from something with lungs much larger than mine. I raised my camera, hands shaking so bad I could barely hold it steady. Through my 200mm lens, I finally got a clear view of something. It was only for a second, but what I saw doesn't make sense. I saw an eye, a very human-like eye, but massive, set in a face covered in dark brown hair. The eye was looking directly at me, and there was intelligence there. Not animal intelligence, but something else. Something that knew exactly what it was doing. I took the shot, but in my panic, I'd forgotten to adjust my settings from the eagle photographs. The image came out completely overexposed. That's when it made a sound I'll never forget. A single, sharp vocalizations that felt like a warning. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran as fast as I could, no longer caring about direction or stealth. I could hear it moving parallel to me again, but faster now, crashing through the undergrowth. I finally broke out onto the logging road, my lungs burning. The crashes in the woods stopped. When I finally caught my breath and looked back, the forest was silent again. But this time, it was normal forest silence, with birds and small animals going about their business. I made it back to my car and drove straight to the ranger station. The rangers were professional but skeptical. They went to check out my campsite the next day, but said they only found some scattered garbage and what looked like bear activity. They explained away the tracks as belonging to a large black bear walking in its own footprints. But I know what I saw. More importantly, I know what I felt. There was an intelligence behind that encounter. Something was deliberately destroying my camp, following me, and herding me out of its territory. I've spent my entire career observing wildlife, and nothing in my experience explains what happened that day. I still have the photos, the blurry ones of something moving through the trees, and all the overexposed ones. I even managed to record some of the vocalizations on my backup camera's video function, though the quality is poor. I've shown them to a few trusted colleagues over the years, but I've mostly kept this story to myself. Until now, I guess. I still do wildlife photography, but I don't camp alone anymore. And I always have a satellite phone with me now. Sometimes when I'm setting up a shot in the wilderness, I'll get that feeling again. That sensation of being watched by something intelligent. When that happens, I pack up and leave, no matter how good the potential shot might be. The thing that stays with me most isn't the footprints, or the destroyed camp, or even the glimpses of something that shouldn't exist. It's that eye contact. In that brief moment, I knew I was looking at something that was looking back at me with at least as much intelligence as I was looking at it with. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it's still out there, watching other photographers and hikers, deciding whether to reveal itself or remain hidden in the shadows of the North Cascades. Story 11. I've been a professional fishing guide in Pagosa Springs for over 15 years. But what happened on October 12, 2019, completely changed my understanding of what lives in our wilderness. I still get goosebumps thinking about it, and even though it's been a few years, I've struggled to share this story. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone else has seen something similar. That morning started like any other early fall day. I was setting up for a guided fishing trip, arriving at my usual spot on the San Juan River around 4:30 a.m. The air was crisp, probably around 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was this dense fog hanging over the water, pretty typical for that time of year. I've always liked getting there early to check conditions and prep my gear before clients arrive. I parked my truck at the Williams Creek Road access point, about 2 miles upstream from downtown Pagosa. The spot's perfect because it has this wide, gravelly bank where I can lay out all my equipment. I remember checking my phone's weather app. Clear skies predicted, light wind from the northwest, perfect fishing conditions. I was organizing my tackle boxes under the beam of my headlamp when I first noticed something was off. You know how sometimes the wilderness just feels wrong? The usual pre-dawn chorus of birds hadn't started, and the crickets had gone completely silent. At first, I blamed it on the cold, but then I caught this smell, like a mix of wet dog and rotting vegetation, but much stronger than anything I'd encountered before. It was so pungent, it made my eyes water. That's when I heard the splashing. Not the gentle kind you get from trout jumping, but heavy, deliberate movements in the water. Through the fog, about 50 yards upstream, I could make out a large, dark shape standing in the middle of the river. The water there is usually waist deep on me, but it was only up to this thing's knees. My first thought was bear, but as I stood there frozen, headlamp beam pointed downward, thank God, I realized this was something else entirely. It was huge. I'd estimate at least 8 feet tall and stood on 2 legs. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging almost to its knees, and its shoulders must have been twice as wide as mine. What happened next still haunts me. The creature, and I know how crazy this sounds, was fishing. It stood completely still, then suddenly plunged its arms into the water with incredible speed. When it pulled its hands up, I could see the thrashing of what must have been a large trout. The precision of its movements was terrifying. This wasn't some animal randomly splashing around. This was calculated hunting. I wanted to run back to my truck, but I was paralyzed with fear. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set down the tackle box I was holding. The slight noise it made when it touched the ground was enough. The creature's head snapped in my direction. Even through the fog, I could feel it staring at me. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, we just stayed there, locked in this horrible standoff. Then it made a sound that sent ice through my veins, a low, rumbling vocalization that started like a growl but rose into something almost like speech, but not quite. It was nothing like a bear or elk or anything else I've heard in these mountains. The creature took one step toward my bank, and that broke my paralysis. I backed away slowly toward my truck, never turning my back. That's when I stumbled on some rocks and dropped my headlamp. The light bounced and pointed directly at the thing for a split second before going out. What I saw in that brief moment of illumination will stay with me forever. Dark, matted fur covering its entire body, massive, muscular shoulders. But it was the face that terrified me most. A mixture of ape-like features, but with an intelligence in its eyes that seemed almost human. The way it reacted to the light was strange too. Instead of running away, it raised one arm to shield its eyes, just like a person would. I practically fell into my truck and started the engine. As I was turning around to leave, my headlights swept across the river. The creature was gone, but I could see the ripples in the water where it had been standing. When daylight came, I went back with my smartphone to document anything I could find. The mud on the bank had several clear footprints. They were human-like but massive, at least 16 inches long and incredibly deep in the mud, suggesting whatever made them was exceptionally heavy. I took several photos and measurements. Though my hands were shaking so badly, many of the pictures came out blurry. What really got to me were the fish remains I found scattered along the bank. Several large trout, some over 20 inches, had been partially eaten. But the way they were handled was bizarre. They showed clear finger marks, like someone with enormous hands had gripped them. The The marks were nothing like bear claws or other predator signs I'm familiar with. Over the next few weeks, I started arriving at my fishing spots even earlier, hoping to document more evidence. On October 23rd, around 3:45 a.m., I managed to record some sounds from across the river using my phone. The audio isn't great, but there's this series of wood knocks followed by what sounds like that same vocalization I heard before. I've played it for several wildlife biologists, but none could identify what made those sounds. Other guides and locals started sharing similar stories. Mike, who runs the fly shop downtown, told me 2 of his clients cancelled their trip after seeing something massive and hair-covered cross the river at dusk. Sarah, another guide, found an area just off Williams Creek Road where the vegetation was all pressed down in a circular pattern about 8 feet in diameter, with strange dark hairs caught in the nearby brush. The local authorities did investigate after multiple reports came in. They found the bedding area Sarah had discovered and collected some of the hair samples. They also took casts of the footprints I found. I followed up several times but never got a straight answer about what they found. The official line was ongoing investigation, but eventually they just stopped returning my calls. I still guide on the San Juan almost daily, but I've changed my habits. I don't arrive quite so early anymore, and I always bring a more powerful flashlight and a can of bear spray. I've only heard those distinctive sounds a few more times, always before dawn, always from the densely forested opposite bank. I haven't had another clear sighting, but sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick over the river, I can feel eyes watching me from the tree line. The whole experience has left me with more questions than answers. I've spent my entire adult life on these rivers, thought I knew every animal and its habits. But what I saw that morning doesn't fit with anything I understood about our local wildlife. The intelligence it displayed while fishing, the almost human-like movements and reactions, the sheer size of it, none of it makes sense. I've gone back and forth about sharing this story. I know how it sounds. If someone had told me this tale a few years ago, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But I know what I saw. Those footprints were real. Those fish were killed and eaten by something with hands. And those sounds. I still have the recording on my phone, though I rarely play it anymore. Sometimes late at night when I'm about to drift off to sleep, I hear that vocalization in my head, and I'm right back there on that foggy riverbank, realizing that everything I thought I knew about these mountains was wrong. Story 12. We've been producing maple syrup for over 30 years. It's not a huge operation, just about 200 taps across our 15-acre wooded property. We're both in our late 60s now, but we've always managed everything ourselves. The work keeps us active, and the extra income helps with the bills. That winter started normally enough. We got our taps in during late January when the temperatures were right, below freezing at night and above freezing during the day. The first strange thing we noticed was in early February. I went out one morning to check the collection buckets, and several of them were completely empty. At first, I thought maybe they were leaking, but these were sturdy metal buckets we'd used for years. Betty suggested it might be bears, but it was the middle of winter, and bears should have been hibernating. Plus, there was no damage to the buckets or spiles. They were just empty. After it happened 3 more times, I decided to set up some trail cameras. We had 4 old game cameras from when our son used to hunt on the property. I mounted them near the trees where we'd had the most problems. The weather that week was brutal. Temperatures dropping to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit at night, with about 2 feet of snow on the ground. Just walking out to check the buckets was exhausting, trudging through that deep snow. On February 12th, something triggered one of the cameras around 3:15 a.m. When I checked the footage the next morning, my hands started shaking so bad I could barely hold the camera. There, in the grainy night vision, was something I still can't fully explain. A massive figure, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, was standing at one of our maple trees. It was covered in thick dark fur, and it was drinking directly from our collection bucket, just lifting it up to its face like it was a cup. I showed Betty the footage, and we must have watched it 50 times that day. The creature moved with such purpose, like it knew exactly what it was doing. It wasn't just randomly discovering the sap. It went straight for the bucket. The way it moved between the trees was almost human-like, But the size and the fur, there's no way it was a person in a suit. Not in that weather, not at that hour, not moving that naturally. The next day, I found the tracks. The snow was deep enough that whatever made them had to really push through it. Each footprint was at least 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. I tried to follow them, but they led deeper into the woods, eventually disappearing where the trees got thicker. What really got to me was how the tracks showed it was walking on 2 legs, with a stride length that had to be at least 5 feet. That night, around 10 p.m., we heard it. Betty and I were watching TV when this sound started coming from the woods, like someone taking a baseball bat to the tree trunks. Asterisk, whack, 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 asterisk. It had this rhythm to it, almost like it was communicating. The sound moved around our property, never staying in one spot for too long. Our dog, Max, who usually barks at everything, just sat there whining and trembling. The game cameras caught it 3 more times over the next week. Always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., always going straight for the sap buckets. In one clip, you can see it stop and look directly at the camera. Those eyes, they reflected the infrared light like a deer's would, but there was something disturbingly intelligent in the way it stared at the camera. We finally called the local police on February 20th. I didn't want to sound crazy, but something had to be done. 2 officers came out and took our report. They were professional about it, but I could tell they were skeptical until I showed them the footage. They spent about an hour walking our property, taking pictures of the tracks and collecting some dark, coarse hairs they found stuck to the bark of several trees. The officers sent the hair samples to some lab for testing. We never got official results, but one of them told me off the record that the lab couldn't match them to any known animal species in Vermont. They just said the DNA was inconclusive. The visits continued through early March. We started losing about 5 gallons of sap every night. It doesn't sound like much, but that's nearly 2 gallons of finished syrup, hundreds of dollars worth. But honestly, by that point, we were more fascinated than angry. This creature, whatever it was, had developed a taste for maple sap and figured out how to get it. The last time we saw it was March 15th. The weather was starting to warm up, and sap collection was nearly done for the season. The camera caught it one final time, drinking from a bucket, but this time it did something different. After finishing, it turned toward the camera and made this gesture. It reached up and broke off a small branch from the maple tree, then laid it carefully across the top of the empty bucket. Almost like leaving payment or showing respect. We never saw it again after that night. The following winter, we installed an updated tubing system instead of buckets, running everything directly to our sugar house. Part of me feels guilty about that, like we took away something it had come to rely on. Sometimes, on cold winter nights, we still hear those knocking sounds from the woods. Betty says we should put out a few buckets next season, just in case it comes back. Maybe we will. The experience changed how I see these woods. I've lived in Vermont my whole life, been in these forests thousands of times, but now I know there's something else out there. Something that's smart enough to find and use our sap collection systems, strong enough to move through deep snow like it's nothing, and careful enough to never leave any evidence besides footprints and a few hairs. I still have the game camera footage saved on an old SD card, but I haven't watched it in years. Some things are better left in the past, but every time I taste our maple syrup, I can't help but wonder if somewhere out there in the Green Mountains, that creature is missing its winter treats. Story 13. I need to share what happened to me and my crew back in 2001 while we were working on a construction project in Saranac Lake, New York. I was the site supervisor for a custom home build about 4 miles outside of town, deep in the Adirondacks. What started as routine missing tools turned into something that still keeps me up at night, even after all these years. The property was pretty isolated, about half a mile off the main road, surrounded by dense forest. Perfect spot for a luxury vacation home, but a nightmare for construction logistics. We had to bring in everything by truck, including a site trailer where we kept our tools and supplies. The owner wanted minimal tree clearing, so we were basically building in a pocket carved out of old-growth forest. Things started getting weird about 3 weeks into the project. At first, it was just small stuff. Tools not being where we left them, equipment moved around overnight. I figured maybe some local kids were messing with us, though it seemed unlikely given how remote the site was. But then our lunches started disappearing from the trailer. Not just one or two, all of them, every couple of days. The weird part was there was never any damage to the trailer, no broken windows, no forced locks, just missing food. I started documenting everything, taking photos of how we left the site each evening. That's when I noticed a pattern. Tools weren't just moved randomly, they were being organized. Shovels grouped with shovels, hammers with hammers, power tools arranged by size. Whatever was doing this had some kind of method to it. The turning point came one Monday morning in late October. We'd poured a section of foundation concrete late Friday afternoon. When we arrived Monday, there were footprints in the now hardened concrete. Not regular footprints, these things were huge, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length between them was massive, like 4, 5 feet. I've been in construction for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like it. That's when I decided to install some game cameras around the site. I bought 4 high-end trail cams and mounted them at different angles, 2 on trees overlooking the trailer, 1 facing the foundation area, and 1 pointing at our equipment storage area. The cameras had night vision and motion sensors. I didn't tell the crew about them at first, didn't want to spook anyone or have them thinking I was crazy. 3 nights later, the cameras caught something that made my blood run cold. Around 2:30 a.m., this figure appeared on the edge of the work site. The night vision made it look greenish-grey, but you could clearly see it was covered in thick hair or fur. The height was hard to judge exactly, but using the equipment for scale, I'd estimate at least 7.5 feet tall. It walked upright, completely bipedal, but with a gait that was definitely not human. The footage shows it methodically moving through the site, examining our equipment with what I can only describe as curiosity. It would pick up tools, turn them over in its massive hands, and then carefully place them with similar items. At one point, it spent nearly 10 minutes studying a circular saw, rotating it and running its fingers along the blade. But what really got to me was its behavior around the trailer. It knew how to open the door, not by breaking it. It used the handle, though it struggled a bit with its huge fingers. Inside, it went straight for our lunch coolers. It opened them carefully, took out the food, and, this detail still haunts me, it rewrapped what it didn't eat and put it back. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. This thing had intelligence. The next day, I showed the footage to my crew. Some wanted to quit on the spot. Can't say I blamed them. But we had a job to finish, and walking away wasn't really an option. We started leaving out extra food, sandwiches, fruit, energy bars, hoping it would take those instead of breaking in. It worked mostly. The food would disappear overnight, and in return, our tools would be meticulously organized every morning. Then we started finding the structures. The first one was about 50 yards into the woods behind the site, a dome-shaped shelter made from interwoven branches and saplings. It was surprisingly well constructed, with a clear entrance and even a crude bed of leaves inside. Over the next week, we found 3 more similar structures in a rough circle around our site, each about 150 yards apart. The game cameras caught more footage over the following weeks. The creature would appear most nights, usually between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. Sometimes it would bring things from the forest, branches, stones, once even a deer carcass that it left near our dumpster. It seemed to be studying us as much as we were studying it. One night, I stayed late to finish some paperwork in the trailer. Around midnight, I heard heavy footsteps outside. The trailer door handle started to turn. I sat there, frozen, as the door slowly opened. The smell hit me first, like wet dog mixed with something musty and wild. I caught a glimpse of its face in the dim light. Dark eyes set deep under a heavy brow, surprisingly expressive. For a moment, our eyes met. Then it slowly backed away and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't sleep for 2 days after that. The encounters continued for about 2 months. We got used to finding our tools arranged in neat groups each morning. The crew started leaving notes with the food, simple things like, "Thank you," or "Hope you enjoy." Sometimes we'd find crude marks scratched in the dirt near the trailer, not quite writing but definitely deliberate patterns. Then, as winter set in, the visits became less frequent. The last footage we got was in early December. The creature stood at the edge of the site for several minutes, looking at the nearly completed house, then turned and walked into the forest. We never saw it again. We finished the house in January 2002. Before we left, I took extensive measurements and photos of the footprints and structures we'd found. The prints were consistent, always 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes and a mid-tarsal break that primate experts later told me was characteristic of great apes. The structures showed clear signs of tool use and spatial planning. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened. I still have the footage, though it's not as clear as I'd like. Early 2000s trail cams weren't great in low light. I've shown it to a few experts, but most just shake their heads or make vague comments about bears. But I know what I saw. We all do. The thing that stays with me most isn't the size or strength of the creature. It's the intelligence it displayed, the way it organized tools, its curiosity about our equipment, the clear pattern to its behavior. Whatever this was, it wasn't just some animal. It was thinking, learning, maybe even trying to communicate in its own way. I still drive by that property sometimes. The house is occupied now, and I've never heard reports of anything strange from the owners. But sometimes, when I'm in that area at night, I catch a whiff of that distinct musty smell or hear heavy footsteps in the woods. And I wonder if it's still out there, watching, learning, trying to understand us as much as we're trying to understand it. I've never posted about this before, but I think it's important to share. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I do. But everything I've written here is true. I have the footage, photos, and 5 other crew members who can verify every detail. Something intelligent lives in those woods, something that bridges the gap between animal and human. And for a brief time in 2001, it let us glimpse into its world. Story 14. It started in early March 2017. I had set up a network of trail cameras across a 5-square-mile area of the forest, primarily focusing on known deer trails and feeding areas. The location was about 15 miles outside of Oak Ridge proper, in a relatively untouched section of forest. I had carefully mapped out each camera location using GPS coordinates and was collecting data on deer movement patterns, population density, and behavior. The first 3 weeks were completely normal. I'd check the cameras every few days, change batteries when needed, and download the footage. The deer patterns were exactly what you'd expect. Regular movements at dawn and dusk, typical feeding behaviors, nothing out of the ordinary. But on March 23rd, everything changed. I was reviewing the footage from camera hash 4, which was positioned near a natural clearing about 3 miles deep into the forest. At 2:47 a.m., something triggered the motion sensor. I expected to see a deer, maybe a bear, but what appeared on my screen made my blood run cold. The infrared footage showed something massive moving through the frame. It was clearly bipedal, walking upright with a smooth, deliberate gait that was unmistakably different from a bear. Based on the reference markers I had placed in the camera's field of view, this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. I've spent my entire career in wildlife biology. I know every large animal species in Tennessee. This wasn't any of them. The creature had a thick, muscular build covered in what appeared to be dark hair. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, and it moved with a purpose that suggested intelligence. Initially, I told myself it had to be a hoax, maybe someone in a suit. But I knew how remote this location was. You'd have to hike several hours through difficult terrain just to reach this spot. Plus, the way it moved, no human could replicate that fluid motion in a suit, especially not in pitch darkness through dense forest. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with gathering more evidence. I added more cameras, eventually having 15 stations set up throughout the area. I also began placing audio recorders, hoping to capture any vocalizations. The amount of data I was collecting was overwhelming, but patterns started emerging. The creature seemed to be actively hunting deer. I'd see footage of deer suddenly bolting, and then minutes later, the figure would appear, moving in the same direction. It was displaying hunting behavior that suggested high intelligence, using terrain features for cover, moving upwind of prey, and showing remarkable patience. But it was the vocalizations that really got to me. On April 12th, around 1:15 a.m., one of my audio recorders captured something that still makes my skin crawl. It started as a low rumbling sound, almost below human hearing range, but then transformed into a series of calls unlike anything I've ever heard. It wasn't a howl or a scream. It was more like structured vocalizations, almost speech-like in its complexity. The sound carried for miles through the forest, and in the recordings, you could hear other similar calls responding from different directions. The physical evidence started accumulating too. I found footprints, massive ones, 17 inches long and 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. They showed clear dermal ridges, like human fingerprints, in the mud, which would be impossible to fake. The stride length was enormous, over 6 feet between prints, and the depth of the impressions suggested something weighing at least 800 pounds. What really caught my attention were the structures. Deep in the forest, I started finding complex arrangements of broken branches and small trees. These weren't random, they were clearly constructed, with smaller branches woven through larger ones in patterns that couldn't have occurred naturally. Some formed crude shelter-like structures, while others seemed to serve no obvious purpose but were definitely intentionally created. By May, I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I approached 2 colleagues from my department, Dr. Sarah Chen and Dr. Mark Rodriguez. I expected them to dismiss everything, but after showing them the footage, audio recordings, and taking them to some of the sites, they were stunned. Within a week, we had a formal research team assembled. The most intense encounter happened on June 7th. I was checking cameras at dusk, something I'd done hundreds of times by then. The forest suddenly went completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming sensation of being watched. Then came the smell, this powerful, musky odor that was unlike anything I'd encountered before. It wasn't just the typical decay smell you get in forests. This was different, more organic and alive. I slowly turned around, and there it was, standing about 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a large oak tree. Even in the failing light, I could make out its massive frame. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with a huge barrel chest and powerful shoulders. Its face was surprisingly flat, with a prominent brow ridge. But what struck me most were its eyes. They reflected the dying sunlight with an almost reddish glow, but there was undeniable intelligence in them. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. It made no aggressive moves, just watched me with what I can only describe as curiosity. Then it slowly stepped behind the tree, and by the time I worked up the courage to move closer, it was gone. The only evidence it left behind were some broken branches and a few clear footprints in the soft earth. The cameras continued capturing images of the creature through August. We documented clear patterns in its movement, usually following a roughly circular route through its territory every 3-4 days. It seemed to have favorite areas for different activities, certain spots for hunting, others for what appeared to be rest or shelter. Then, just as mysteriously as it appeared, the sightings stopped. By September, our cameras showed no sign of the creature, the strange vocalizations ceased, and the forest returned to its normal patterns. We conducted extensive searches but found no explanation for its disappearance. The university has all our evidence, hundreds of photos, hours of audio recordings, plaster casts of footprints and detailed field notes. But there's been no official statement, no public release of the findings. My colleagues and I have debated for years about what to do with this information. We're scientists, trained to be skeptical and demand proof. But what we documented during those months defies conventional explanation. I still go back to those woods sometimes, hoping to find some sign of its return. The locals have their stories, generations of tales about something living in those forests. I used to dismiss those stories as folklore. Now I'm not so sure. Whatever it was we documented during those months in 2017, it was real, it was intelligent, and it's still out there somewhere. I'm sure of that much. Story 15. I've been debating whether to share this for the past 14 years, but what my wife Sarah and I experienced during our hiking trip in Cedar City, Utah back in 2010 still haunts us. I need to get this off my chest, even though I know some people won't believe it. I've never been one for supernatural stuff or conspiracy theories. I'm just a regular guy who loves outdoor activities and photography. But what happened that day in September changed everything I thought I knew about what exists in our forests. We were 3 days into what was supposed to be a week-long hiking trip in the Dixie National Forest, about 15 miles northeast of Cedar City. The weather had been perfect, clear skies, temperatures in the mid-60s, and virtually no wind. We'd set up our campsite in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, about half a mile from the nearest marked trail. The spot was isolated enough to feel like true wilderness, but still within reasonable distance of civilization if we needed it. That morning, we decided to do a day hike to explore some interesting rock formations we'd spotted the previous day. We packed our day packs with water, trail mix, and basic survival gear, leaving our main supplies and tent at the campsite. The hike out was uneventful. We took photos, identified some interesting birds, and enjoyed the solitude. Everything felt normal until we started heading back around 3:30 p.m. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. If you spend time in the wilderness, you know there's usually a constant background noise, birds, insects, wind in the trees. But as we got within about a quarter mile of our campsite, everything just stopped. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, nothing. Sarah noticed it first and grabbed my arm. "Matt, something feels off," she whispered. I tried to play it cool, but my skin was already starting to crawl. When we reached our campsite, my heart nearly stopped. Our tent, a sturdy REI half-dome that had weathered multiple camping trips, was completely destroyed. Not just knocked over, but literally torn apart. The poles were bent and snapped, and the fabric was shredded like paper. Our supplies were scattered everywhere. The heavy-duty plastic container we used for food storage was cracked open like an egg, its contents partially eaten or crushed. Even our metal cooking gear was dented and tossed dozens of feet from where we'd left it. My first thought was bears, but something didn't add up. I've dealt with bear encounters before, and this was different. The destruction seemed more deliberate. There were no claw marks on the food container, just crushing damage like something had squeezed it until it broke. And the tent wasn't just ripped, it was methodically torn at the seams in places, almost like whatever did this was examining how it was put together. The sun was starting to get low, and we knew we had to make a decision fast. The nearest road was about 8 miles away, and trying to hike out in the dark would be dangerous. We decided to construct a basic shelter using our emergency tarp and what remained of our camping gear, setting up about 50 yards from our original campsite, closer to a large boulder that would give us some protection on one side. That's when things got truly terrifying. As darkness fell, the forest around us came alive with sounds I still can't fully explain. It started with what sounded like heavy branches breaking in the distance, but the sounds were rhythmic, almost like footsteps. Then came the smell. I've been around plenty of wild animals, but this was different. A powerful, musty odor that made my eyes water. It was like a mix of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something else I couldn't identify. Around 10:30 p.m., we started hearing the vocalizations. I hesitate to call them calls or screams because they were unlike anything I've ever heard an animal make. They started as low, rumbling growls that gradually built into high-pitched howls that seemed to go on forever. The sounds seemed to be coming from multiple directions, as if whatever was making them was circling our position. I had my iPhone ready. This was 2010, so the camera wasn't great, especially in low light, and our high-powered flashlight. Sarah was clutching our bear spray, though we both doubted it would do much good against whatever was out there. The footsteps were getting closer, and the smell was becoming overwhelming. That's when I saw it. Through the beam of our flashlight, about 40 yards away, standing between 2 large pines, was something that shouldn't exist. It was massive. I'm 6'2", and this thing towered over any person I've ever seen. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its proportions were just wrong. The arms were too long, hanging almost to its knees. The head sat directly on broad shoulders with no real neck visible. I managed to film about 15 seconds of footage before it moved. The way it moved, that's what really gets me. Not like a person in a costume, not like any animal I know. It covered about 30 feet in what seemed like 2 strides, disappearing behind a cluster of trees. The footage is shaky and dark, but you can clearly see the mass of the creature and its movement. I've shown it to a few trusted friends over the years, but I'm honestly scared to share it publicly. I don't want to become that guy who claims he saw Bigfoot. We spent the rest of the night huddled in our makeshift shelter, listening to those horrible sounds and catching occasional glimpses of movement in the darkness. Neither of us slept. The creature or creatures seemed to maintain a perimeter around our camp, never coming closer than about 30 yards, but never leaving either. The vocalizations continued intermittently until about 4:30 a.m. when they suddenly stopped. As soon as there was enough light, we investigated the area. What we found made my blood run cold. There was a clear trail of footprints circling our shelter. Each print was nearly 16 inches long and incredibly deep. Whatever made them must have weighed hundreds of pounds. Several trees in the area had deep scratch marks about 8 feet off the ground, and some smaller trees were broken off completely about 6 feet up, as if something had just pushed them over while walking past. We took some quick photos of the prints and marks on the trees, grabbed what we could salvage of our gear, and got out of there as fast as we could. We made it back to our car in record time and drove straight to Cedar City. We did file a report with the Forest Service, but I could tell from their faces they didn't believe us, even though we had the photos and video. I've spent countless hours since then trying to rationalize what happened. I've researched every large animal native to Utah, studied weather phenomena, looked into other possible explanations. Nothing fits. The footage I captured sits on an external hard drive in my desk drawer. Sometimes I take it out and watch it again, just to remind myself that it was real, that we really did experience something inexplicable in those woods. The worst part is the lingering effect it's had on us. We still go camping and hiking, but never in that area, and never anywhere too remote. Every unusual sound in the woods brings it all back. Sarah says she sometimes wakes up at night thinking she can smell that distinctive odor again. I don't know what we encountered that night in Cedar City. I don't claim to know if Bigfoot exists or not. All I know is that something intelligent and massive was in those woods with us, something that demonstrated both curiosity and restraint. It could have easily harmed us, but chose not to. Sometimes I wonder if it was studying us as much as we were studying it. The video and photos are still in my possession, but I'm not ready to share them publicly. Maybe someday. For now, I just needed to tell this story, to put it into words. If you're hiking in the Dixie National Forest, especially in the more remote areas northeast of Cedar City, be careful. And if the forest suddenly goes quiet, maybe it's time to leave. Story 16. It all started in late September 1999. I had about 40 sheep and a decent-sized chicken coop on my 85-acre property, which backs up against the Jefferson National Forest. I'd been farming that land for nearly 15 years at that point, and I knew every creek, every hollow, and every strange sound those woods could make. But what happened that fall was different. The first sign something was wrong came when my sheep started acting peculiar at night. Now, sheep can be skittish animals, but they usually settle down after sunset. But these guys, they were huddling together, bleating constantly, and refusing to spread out across their usual grazing areas. At first I chalked it up to maybe a coyote or a bear in the area. We get those sometimes, though they rarely cause much trouble. Then my chickens started disappearing. Not one or two. I lost 6 in the first week of October alone. Whatever was taking them wasn't leaving much evidence behind, just some scattered feathers and bent chicken wire. The weird thing was, the wire was bent outward from the top of the coop, about 8 feet up. Bears usually tear through the sides, and coyotes dig underneath. This was different. I remember standing there one morning, looking at that mangled chicken wire, and feeling this deep sense of unease. The air felt different somehow, heavier. There was this smell too, something I'd never encountered before, sort of like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation, but much more pungent. It made my eyes water. After losing 9 chickens in 2 weeks, I decided to install some security cameras. Nothing fancy, just 3 battery-powered trail cams I bought from the hunting supply store in town. I set them up around the chicken coop and the sheep pen. That's when things got really strange. The first footage I got was on October 17th around 4:30 a.m. I remember the date because it was my youngest daughter's birthday, and I was up early preparing for her party. The camera facing the sheep pen caught something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. This figure, standing just at the edge of the camera's range. It was huge. I'd estimate at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. The video was grainy, but you could clearly see it was covered in dark, matted fur. It just stood there, watching my sheep for almost 20 minutes. The sheep were pressed against the far side of their enclosure, completely silent, which is not normal for them. Usually they make some noise when they're alarmed, but it was like they were terrified into silence. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. I started finding these massive footprints all around my property, mainly after rainy nights when the ground was soft. They were huge, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. I tried to make plaster casts of a few, but they were always partially filled with water and didn't come out clear enough. The sounds were what really got to me, though. Living in the country, you get used to all sorts of animal noises, but they were different. It started with what sounded like wood knocking, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. These would usually happen around dusk, coming from different directions in the forest, but the worst were the screams. The first time I heard them, I was out checking on the sheep around 11 p.m. It was a clear, cold night, and the sound just cut through the air like a knife. It started as this low, guttural growl that built into this horrific scream. Not quite human, not quite animal. It was loud enough to set off car alarms in my driveway about 300 yards from the forest edge. My dogs, 2 German shepherds who'd chase off bears without hesitation, ran straight into the house and wouldn't come out until morning. By late October, word had gotten around. Other farmers in the area started sharing similar stories. Jim Mackenzie, about 3 miles down the road, lost several goats. Sarah Thompson's horses refused to stay in their pasture, breaking through the fence multiple times to get closer to the barn. Everyone had a story about strange noises, missing animals, or that terrible smell. The game cameras kept catching glimpses, never a clear shot, but enough to know something massive was out there. One video from October 25th shows it moving between 2 trees. The way it moved, it wasn't like a bear. It was upright, bipedal, but with this fluid grace that seemed impossible for something that size. Things came to a head in early November. A group of us, about 15 local farmers and hunters, decided to organize a search of the forest behind our properties. We found something that none of us were prepared for. About 2 miles into the woods, in a particularly dense area, we discovered what looked like temporary shelters. Not like human camping shelters. These were crude structures made from broken tree branches, woven together and covered with layers of bark and leaves. They were huge, too. The entrance to one was at least 7 feet tall. Around these structures, we found more evidence, dozens of footprints, areas where the ground had been dug up, looking for grubs maybe, and trees with bark stripped off at heights none of us could reach. The smell there was overwhelming. That same putrid, musky odor I'd noticed near my chicken coop, but 10 times stronger. What really shook me was what we found inside one of the structures. There were chicken feathers, lots of them, and some looked fresh. But what really got me were the sheep bones. They'd been cracked open, the marrow cleaned out. The breaks in the bones weren't like anything I'd seen before, not like how a bear or wolf would do it. After that search, things actually started to calm down. The visits to my farm became less frequent, though they didn't stop entirely. I still heard the wood knocking and occasional screams, but they seemed more distant, like whatever it was had moved deeper into the forest. By December, the activity had almost completely ceased. The last footage I got was on December 3rd, just a brief glimpse of something large moving through the trees at the edge of my property. After that, nothing. My sheep settled down, no more chickens disappeared, and that horrible smell faded away. But here's the thing. Every now and then, usually during the fall months, I'll hear those wood knocks again. Or I'll find a single massive footprint in a muddy part of my field, just enough to remind me that whatever was here in '99 might still be out there, watching and waiting. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Could it have been a bear? A hoax? Some kind of mass hysteria? But then I remember the way it moved in those videos, the intelligence in how it avoided the cameras, the complexity of those shelters we found. Whatever was on my farm that fall, it wasn't just some animal, and it definitely wasn't human. I still farm the same land, but I've made some changes. The chicken coop is now reinforced with metal bars, and I've installed better security lighting. My sheep have a more secure enclosure closer to the house. But sometimes, on cold fall nights when the wind blows just right through the trees, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, watching from the darkness of the Jefferson National Forest. I've never shared this story publicly before. For years, I thought people would think I was crazy. But after recently hearing about similar experiences from other farmers in the area, I felt it was time to share what happened. I don't know what that creature was, but I know what I saw, what I smelled, and what I heard, and I know I'm not the only one who experienced it. Story 17. I've been in the logging business for over 25 years, working my way up from operating skidders to supervising crews in northern New Hampshire. What happened in Berlin back in 2006 still keeps me up some nights, and I'm finally sharing this because I need others to know what's out there. It was early October, and we'd started a new contract clearing a section about 12 miles outside Berlin. The first weird thing we noticed was on our second day on site. I was doing my morning walkthrough with the foreman, marking trees for the day's cut, when we came across something I'd never seen before. There was a cluster of young birch trees, maybe 15, 20 feet tall, that were bent over into perfect arches, with their tops woven together like some kind of natural basket. These weren't saplings. These were trees thick as your arm, bent over without breaking. Mike, my foreman, tried saying it was from snow damage, but I'd seen plenty of snow-bent trees in my career. This was different. The patterns were too regular, too intentional. We counted 8 trees in that first cluster, all bent at roughly the same height, all intertwined at the top in this bizarre pattern. What really got me was how fresh it looked. The bark wasn't scarred or aged where the bends were. This had been done recently. We marked it on our site map and kept going, but over the next few days, we found 4 more of these structures scattered through our cutting zone. Each one was slightly different, but they all had that same deliberate feel to them. The crew started getting uneasy, especially since we kept finding them deeper in our cutting zone, like something was marking territory. The first real incident happened about a week in. We were running 2 crews, one handling the main cut, while the other was clearing access paths for the equipment. Around 2 p.m., the radio crackled with Joe's voice from the path-clearing team. He was badly shaken, saying they'd been hearing something following them through the dense brush for the past hour. Not just twigs snapping, but heavy footsteps and this weird wooden knocking sound, like someone hitting trees with a baseball bat. I drove out to their location in my pickup. When I got there, the 3 guys were huddled near their equipment, looking pale. That's when I heard it myself. This deep, throaty sound, almost like a moose, but not quite right. It was too sustained, too modulated. It came from maybe 200 yards away, then was answered by another call from the opposite direction. The hair on my neck stood up. Whatever was making those sounds was coordinating. We pulled that crew back to the main site, but things only escalated from there. The next morning, we found 3 of our chainsaws had been taken from the locked equipment container and thrown into the woods. These weren't just tossed. They were bent and twisted like they'd been worked over with some incredible force. The padlock on the container wasn't cut. It was crushed. That same day, we started finding the prints. At first, they were just deep depressions in the softer ground near the creek, but as we looked closer, we could make out distinct toe impressions. They were huge, easily 16 inches long, and showed a clearly defined arch and ball like a human foot, just scaled up to impossible size. We took photos and measurements, but looking at them just made my stomach turn. Something that big shouldn't exist. The crew was getting seriously spooked by this point. 2 guys quit on the spot when we found a half-eaten deer carcass propped up against our fuel tank one morning. It had been torn apart with incredible force. The spine was literally snapped in half. But it was the placement that got to me. This wasn't random predator behavior. Something had deliberately put it there for us to find. Then came the day that finally shut us down. I was in my truck reviewing cut plans when movement caught my eye at the tree line about 100 yards out. What I saw still doesn't make sense to my brain. It was tall, so tall it didn't look real at first, like someone on stilts, but the proportions were wrong for that. The shoulders were massive, easily twice as wide as any man's, and the arms hung down almost to the knees. It was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, but the face... I only caught a glimpse of the face, but it looked almost human-like, just bigger and broader, with heavy brow ridges. It just stood there watching our operation, not moving, not making a sound, just watching. I scrambled for my phone to take a picture, but my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't get it out of my pocket fast enough. By the time I looked back up, it had melted back into the trees without making a sound. How something that big could move so quietly still haunts me. That night, things came to a head. Around 2 a.m., the motion sensors we'd set up around the equipment yard started going off. The security lights kicked on, and we could hear this tremendous commotion. By the time the night watchman got there, our main harvester had been rolled onto its side. Do you understand what I'm saying? A 20-ton piece of machinery had been flipped over like a toy. The hydraulic lines were ripped out, fluid everywhere. Deep scratches were gouged into the metal of the cab, and the windows were completely shattered. The next morning, I called the company office and shut down the operation. Insurance covered the equipment damage, and we marked it up to vandalism in the official report. What else could we say? That Bigfoot did it? That there were multiple creatures out there smart enough to coordinate and strong enough to flip heavy machinery? The police came out and took statements, but I could tell they didn't know what to make of it. They found more of those massive footprints all around the site, but wrote them off as a hoax. They had to. Accepting them as real would mean accepting something impossible. We never went back to that site. The company quietly cancelled the contract and wrote off the losses. I heard they eventually sold the cutting rights to another outfit, but as far as I know, nobody's tried to work that land since. I've thought a lot about what happened over those weeks, about those woven trees, the calls, the footprints, and especially that figure I saw. I've worked these forests my whole life, and I know the difference between bears, moose, and other wildlife. This was something else, something intelligent, something that was sending us a clear message to get out of its territory. The weirdest part? Over the next few months, I started hearing similar stories from other logging operations in the region, always the same pattern: bent trees, equipment damage, massive footprints. Most kept it quiet, not wanting to spook their crews or attract attention. But word gets around in this industry. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Hell, some days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw, what my crew experienced, and what happened to our equipment. Something is out there in those woods, something that doesn't want us in certain areas. And after what I saw, I'm inclined to respect those wishes. I still work in logging, but I'm a lot more careful now about where we cut. When we're scouting new sites, if I see those bent trees or get that feeling of being watched, we move on. Some places just aren't meant to be logged, and I learned that lesson the hard way. Story 18. It was mid-September, and I'd taken my wife Sarah and our 2 kids, Tommy 12 and Emma 9, camping at a remote spot about 4 miles from the nearest marked trail. We're experienced campers, and I'd researched this location carefully. It was secluded but still technically within the Hiawatha National Forest boundaries. The spot overlooked Lake Superior, and that first afternoon was perfect. Crisp autumn air, leaves just starting to turn, the lake stretching out like glass beneath the cliffs. We set up our main family tent and a smaller one for the kids about 20 feet away. I'm meticulous about our camping setup. Everything has its place. Food goes in sealed containers, then into our bear-proof container, which I always secure 100 yards from camp. I've dealt with black bears before, so I know the drill. We had enough supplies for 5 days: freeze-dried meals, energy bars, trail mix, the usual stuff. The first sign something was off came that first night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to complete silence. If you've spent time in the woods, you know that's not normal. Usually there's always something: crickets, owls, wind in the trees. But this was different. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the whole forest. Then came this smell, not quite rotting meat, more like wet dog mixed with something musty and wild. I've been around plenty of wildlife, but this was different. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't leave the tent. Call it instinct or fear, but something told me to stay put. That's when we heard it, a sound that still gives me chills. It started as this low, rumbling vocalization, almost subsonic, like you could feel it more than hear it. Then it changed into this high-pitched howl that absolutely wasn't a wolf or coyote. It seemed to come from about a quarter-mile away toward the lake. Sarah woke up, and I could feel her grip my arm. The kids, thankfully, slept through it. The next morning, I found our first physical evidence that something was wrong. The bear container had been moved, not knocked over like a bear would do, but deliberately relocated about 30 feet from where I'd secured it. The weird part, it was still locked, but something had systematically opened every Ziploc bag inside through the small gaps in the container's design. Not torn, opened along the seals. The trail mix and energy bars were gone, but the wrapped, freeze-dried meals were left untouched. Whatever did this had dexterity and patience. Then I saw the footprints. They were pressed deep into the soft ground near where the container had been moved, about 20 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. The stride length between prints was huge, easily over 4 feet. I took photos with my phone next to them for scale. I'm 6'1", and these prints made my boots look like a child's shoes in comparison. That second day, we debated packing up and leaving. But the weather report showed storms coming, and the nearest town was a good 3-hour hike. We decided to stay put and fortify our camp. I strung up extra paracord with bells between trees, setting up a perimeter. Around dusk, we started hearing wood knocks, like someone taking a baseball bat to tree trunks. They seemed to come from different directions, almost like they were communicating. The second night was when things escalated. Around midnight, the knocking started again, closer this time. Then we heard heavy footsteps circling our camp, and I mean heavy. You could feel the vibration in the ground. The kids were terrified, so we all huddled in the main tent. I had my hunting knife and bear spray ready, though honestly, I'm not sure what good they would have done. I set up my phone to record the sounds. The footsteps got closer, and then something large moved right past our tent. The fabric bulged inward as whatever it was brushed against it. The smell was overwhelming, that same wet dog musk odor from before, but so strong it made our eyes water. We could hear breathing, deep, heavy breaths, not like any animal I'm familiar with. The third morning I found more footprints, this time right through our campsite. But what really shook me was what we found in the surrounding woods. About 100 yards from camp, there were these structures, lean-tos made from broken branches. Not random storm debris, these were clearly constructed. Some of the branches used were too high for a person to reach without a ladder, and they were snapped, not cut. The real kicker came in the early morning fog of our last day. I was up early, trying to get some photos of the structures, when I saw it. Through the mist, about 50 yards away, stood something massive. It had to be at least 8, 9 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a heavy brow. The photo I managed to take is frustratingly unclear, just a dark silhouette in the fog. But what struck me wasn't just its size, it was how it moved. Fluid, deliberate, almost human-like, but not quite. It watched me for maybe 30 seconds, then turned and walked into the trees. The ground literally shook with each step. We packed up and left within the hour. When we got back to civilization, I reported it to the park rangers. They seemed unsurprised. One of them, an older guy who'd worked the area for decades, asked very specific questions about the wood knocks and structures. He told me they'd had other reports from that area but wouldn't elaborate further. I've gone over this experience countless times in my head. I've researched every large animal native to Michigan. Nothing explains what we encountered. The footprints were too big for bear, the movements too deliberate, the structures too complex. The systematic way our food was examined suggests intelligence. The coordinated knocking implies communication. I still have the photos and audio recordings, though the sound quality isn't great. Mostly just heavy footsteps and those weird vocalizations in the background. The ranger said they'd look into it, but I never heard back. I've only returned to the area once in 2015 just to check. The structures were gone, but I found fresh prints of the same size near the cliff edge. I'm not claiming to know what we encountered. I'm just sharing what happened as accurately as I can remember it. Sometimes I still wake up hearing those wood knocks or smelling that distinctive odor. My kids won't go camping anymore, and honestly, I can't blame them. Some things you experience just don't fit into our normal understanding of the world, and I guess this is one of them. Story 19, or... It was early October 2020, and I was doing field research on some rare fungal species that only grow in that particular region. I'd gotten permission from the Forest Service to collect samples in a remote area about 15 miles east of Forks. The location was perfect: old-growth forest, lots of rainfall, and virtually no human traffic. I'd been working in the area for about 2 weeks, setting up research plots and documenting different species. That morning started like any other. I drove my beat-up Toyota pickup down the logging road just as the sun was coming up, around 7 a.m. The weather was typical for the Olympic Peninsula: overcast, misty, with a temperature around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. I parked at my usual spot, shouldered my backpack with my research equipment, and headed out to check my plots. The first weird thing I noticed was the silence. I mean, forests are usually pretty quiet in the morning, but this was different. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just the sound of water dripping from the trees. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something feels off, and something definitely felt off that morning. I was about 2 miles into my hike when I found the first footprint. I almost walked right past it, but something made me stop. There, in a patch of soft soil, was what looked like a human footprint, except it was huge, probably 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. I'm a scientist. I deal in facts and evidence. I've heard all the Bigfoot stories. Hell, you can't work in these woods without hearing them. But I'd always written them off as folklore or misidentified bear tracks. This was different. The print was clearly a foot, with 5 distinct toes, but the size and depth suggested whatever made it had to weigh at least 500 pounds. My hands were shaking as I took out my phone and started photographing the print. That's when I noticed there were more of them, leading deeper into the forest. The stride length between prints was massive, easily 6 feet. I followed them, documenting each one, trying to maintain my scientific objectivity, even as my heart was pounding. The tracks led to one of my research plots, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. The area had been disturbed, but not in a way that suggested bears or elk. Several rare specimens of Cortinarius violaceus, a purple mushroom I'd been studying, had been carefully harvested, not ripped up or trampled, but picked with precision, leaving the mycelium intact. Whatever did this understood mushroom harvesting. I found crude tools nearby, a sharpened stick that had clearly been used to dig, and a crude basket woven from cedar bark. The workmanship was primitive, but undeniably intentional. I photographed everything, my scientific mind warring with my growing sense of unease. That's when I heard it, a deep, low grunt that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't an elk, it was something else entirely. The sound made every hair on my body stand up. I slowly turned around, scanning the trees, and that's when the smell hit me, a powerful musky odor unlike anything I'd encountered before. Not the rot of decomposition or the scent of a predator, but something uniquely primate. About 100 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive cedar, I saw movement, something large, something dark, something that was watching me. The mist made it hard to see clearly, but I could make out a massive shape, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair. It was standing upright, perfectly still, just watching. I'd set up trail cameras throughout my research area to document wildlife activity around my mushroom plots. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and checked the wireless feed. The camera closest to my location had captured something about an hour earlier, a large bipedal figure moving through the frame. The image was blurry, but clear enough to show a massive, hair-covered body with distinctly human-like proportions. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran. I'm in decent shape, but I've never moved so fast in my life. The whole time, I could hear movement in the forest parallel to my path. Breaking branches, heavy footfalls, that same occasional grunt. Whatever it was keeping pace with me effortlessly. When I finally reached my truck, I was drenched in sweat despite the cold. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard one final grunt, closer this time, and the unmistakable sound of wood knocking on wood. like someone striking a tree with a heavy branch. It was a clear message. This was its territory. Over the next few weeks, I forced myself to return to the site with other researchers. We found more footprints, more harvested mushrooms, more primitive tools. The trail cameras captured several more partial images, always obscured, always just out of focus, but undeniably showing something large and bipedal moving through the forest. What's most fascinating and terrifying is the pattern we discovered. The creature wasn't just randomly picking mushrooms, it was specifically selecting certain species, many of which have medicinal properties. It showed a knowledge of mycology that went beyond simple foraging. This wasn't just some animal, this was something that understood fungi on a sophisticated level. The university wanted to set up a more extensive research project, but within a week of bringing in more equipment, all signs of the creature vanished. The footprints stopped. The mushroom harvesting ceased. The cameras caught nothing. It was as if it had simply disappeared back into the vastness of the Olympic forest. I still do research in those woods, but never alone anymore. Sometimes when I'm working at my plots, I'll catch that distinctive musky smell on the breeze, or hear a distant wood knock, and I know it's still out there, watching. I've started leaving small offerings of choice mushrooms at the edge of my research areas, a sign of respect, I suppose. The scientific community has been skeptical of my findings, of course. Without definitive proof, it's all just anecdotal evidence. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know that deep in the Olympic National Forest, there's something out there that understands far more about the natural world than we give it credit for. I've spent months trying to rationalize what happened that day. Maybe it was a bear, maybe it was an elaborate hoax, maybe the isolation and stress of fieldwork got to me. But then I look at the photos on my phone, the footprints, the tools, the blurry trail cam images, and I know what I experienced was real. There are things in these woods that science hasn't explained yet, things that blur the line between human and animal intelligence. The most unsettling part? Since that encounter, I've started finding unusual mushroom arrangements near my car when I park at certain trailheads. Specific species placed in deliberate patterns. It's like it's trying to communicate, to show me it knows things about fungi that even I don't understand. Sometimes I wonder who's really studying whom out there. I'm sharing this now because I believe the scientific community needs to approach these encounters with an open mind. Whatever I encountered that day wasn't just some undiscovered ape. It was something far more intelligent, something that has developed its own understanding of the forest's resources, and maybe, just maybe, it's been watching us and learning all along. For those who might want to dismiss this as just another Bigfoot story, I get it. I used to be one of you, but science is about observing and documenting the unexplained, not dismissing it because it doesn't fit our current understanding. I don't know what's out there in Olympic National Forest, but I know what I saw, and I know it deserves serious scientific investigation. These days, I still do my research, but I'm more careful, more observant. And sometimes, when I'm deep in the woods and the forest goes quiet, I can feel those eyes on me again. It's a humbling reminder that maybe we don't know these forests and their inhabitants as well as we think we do. Story 20. We arrived in Libby on January 12th. The temperature was hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, -9 degrees Celsius, and there was about 3 feet of snow on the ground. We'd rented a small cabin about 20 miles outside of town, deep in the Kootenai National Forest. Perfect spot. Isolated enough to get close to the wildlife, but with basic amenities to keep our equipment functioning in the cold. The first few days were routine. We set up our automated camera traps along known elk trails. We had about 8 cameras total, spaced roughly half a mile apart. These were high-end trail cams with night vision capability and motion sensors. We'd also set up our main photography blind about a mile from the cabin, overlooking a natural clearing where we'd spotted elk tracks. Everything was normal until January 16th. I was checking the memory cards from our trail cams that morning when I noticed something odd in the snow. At first, I thought it was where an elk had bedded down, but as I got closer, I realized I was looking at footprints. Big footprints, really big footprints. I've tracked every large animal in North America, and these weren't like anything I'd ever seen. They were clearly bipedal, left, right, each print nearly 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length was massive, easily 5-6 feet between steps. What really got me was the depth of the impressions. Whatever made these was heavy, pushing deep into snow that was supporting elk without much displacement. I took photos and measurements, trying to stay rational. Sarah suggested a bear walking on its hind legs, but the gait pattern was all wrong. Bears can walk bipedally, sure, but not with this kind of consistent stride length. Plus, bears were hibernating. We hadn't seen any sign of them since arriving. That night around 2 a.m. we heard it for the first time. We'd been woken up by the elk herd moving through the valley. We could hear their calls echoing. Then everything went dead silent. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. That's when this sound started. It was like a cross between a whale song and a wolf howl, but much deeper and louder. It echoed through the valley for about 30 seconds. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard she left bruises. The next morning we checked our cameras. Most had nothing unusual, but camera 4, positioned along the Eastern Elk Trail, had captured something at 2:17 a.m. The infrared images showed a massive bipedal figure following about 50 yards behind the elk herd. It was hard to get an exact size reference, but comparing it to the surrounding trees, we estimated it at around 9 feet tall. The figure was covered in thick, dark hair, with noticeably long arms and a bulky frame. The image quality wasn't great. Trail cams aren't exactly high-res, but what we could see was enough to make us seriously consider packing up and leaving. But we're professionals, and this was potentially the discovery of a lifetime. We decided to stay, but we modified our approach. We set up additional cameras specifically to track whatever this thing was, and we started carrying a more powerful spotlight and bear spray whenever we went to check the cameras. Over the next few days, we documented more evidence. The footprints continued to appear, always near the elk trails. We found several tree branches snapped off at heights of 8-9 feet, clean breaks that would have required incredible strength. The most disturbing discovery was what we found on January 19th. The remains of an elk calf about a quarter-mile from our cabin. The carcass was wrong. I've seen plenty of predator kills. Wolves, bears, mountain lions. This was different. The bones had been pulled apart with incredible precision, not crushed like you'd see with a bear. There were no tooth marks on the bones, but there were clear signs that they had been manipulated by something with opposable thumbs. The marrow had been extracted from every major bone. That same day, we captured more vocalizations on our audio equipment. These were different from the howl we'd heard, more like wood-knocking sounds followed by low, guttural grunts. The sequence would repeat every few minutes, almost like a pattern. When we reviewed the audio later, we realized the sounds were coming from 2 different directions, as if 2 creatures were communicating with each other. The final straw came on January 21st. We were in our photography blind at dusk, hoping to catch the elk in the remaining light. The temperature had dropped to about 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and light snow was falling. Through our telephoto lenses, we could see the elk herd about 300 yards away, moving nervously. They suddenly scattered, and that's when we saw it. It emerged from the tree line with a fluid, purposeful stride. In the fading light, we could make out its massive frame, covered in dark brown or black hair. Its arms hung down to its knees, and its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders. No visible neck. Sarah started taking pictures frantically while I tried to steady my video camera with shaking hands. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned its head directly toward our blind. There's no way it could have seen us. We were well concealed and downwind, but somehow it knew exactly where we were. It stood there staring in our direction for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or 2. Then it made that same deep, resonant howl we'd heard before, but this time we could see its head tilted back, its chest expanding. The sound vibrated through my entire body. Then it simply turned and walked back into the forest, its gait smooth and deliberate. We sat in that blind for another hour, too terrified to move. When we finally got back to the cabin, we immediately began packing. We left first thing the next morning, explaining to our client that severe weather had forced us to cut the assignment short. We did manage to get photos and videos, but most were too blurry or dark to be conclusive. The best evidence we had, the trail cam photos, the footprint measurements, and the audio recordings, we shared with a few trusted wildlife biologist colleagues. Within weeks, several research teams had set up camp in the area. I've heard they're still conducting studies there, though they're pretty tight-lipped about their findings. I know how this sounds. Before this happened, I would have dismissed anyone telling me this story as either lying or confused. We're trained observers. We make our living by documenting wildlife behavior with scientific accuracy. What we saw out there defied everything we thought we knew about North American wildlife. We haven't been back to Libby since then, and we've mostly stuck to photographing deer and smaller mammals in more populated areas. Sarah still has nightmares about that figure staring at us from the clearing. Sometimes, when I'm editing photos late at night, I'll catch myself straining to hear those wood knocks or that deep, resonant howl. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, some days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what we saw out there in the Montana wilderness. There are things in our forests that we haven't documented, things that have managed to stay hidden despite our best efforts to find them. And maybe, just maybe, they're better off staying hidden. Story 21. I'm a geological surveyor by trade, and I've been mapping caves in Arkansas for over 2 decades now. That spring, we'd gotten permission to explore a newly discovered cave system on private property just outside Mountain View. The landowner had found the entrance while clearing some brush and contacted the local caving society since he wanted it properly documented. Our team consisted of me, Dave, our photography expert, Sarah, our lead safety officer, and Mike, our backup navigator. We'd done probably 100 cave explorations together at that point. The weather that day was perfect for caving, about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, slightly overcast, with no rain in the forecast. The cave entrance was about 3 miles from the nearest road, tucked away in a densely wooded area. We arrived at the site around 8 a.m. The entrance was surprisingly large, about 7 feet high and 5 feet wide. The first thing that struck me as odd was the lack of wildlife sounds near the entrance. Usually you'd hear birds, insects, something, but there was this unsettling silence. I remember Sarah mentioning it seemed weird, but we were all too excited about the new cave to really dwell on it. We did our standard safety checks, testing our primary and backup lights, checking our emergency supplies, radio equipment, and making sure our filming gear was properly waterproofed. The plan was to do an initial 4-hour exploration, mapping the main passages and marking any significant features for future visits. The first hour was pretty standard. The main passage descended at about a 15-degree angle, with some smaller side tunnels branching off. The cave was surprisingly warm for its depth. Usually you expect temperatures around 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, but it felt closer to 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The walls showed typical limestone formation with some impressive flowstone deposits. Things started getting weird around 10:30 a.m., about 800 feet into the main passage. We came across what looked like a deliberate arrangement of broken branches and vegetation. I've seen plenty of debris washed into caves by flooding, but this was different. The branches were woven together, forming a roughly circular structure about 8 feet in diameter. Some of the vegetation was still green, meaning it had been brought in recently. Dave started photographing the structure while I took measurements. That's when we noticed the smell, this awful musky odor that seemed to come and go. It wasn't the usual cave funk or bat guano smell. This was more like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation, but much stronger. We pressed on deeper, and the passages started getting larger. About 1,000 feet in, we found the first tracks. I've been doing this long enough to know what bear tracks look like in cave mud, and these weren't bear tracks. They were roughly human-shaped, but massive, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length between prints was nearly 6 feet. I was taking photos of the prints when we heard it, this low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the cave. It wasn't an echo of our movements or water dripping. This was clearly biological, almost like a cross between a gorilla's grunt and a bear's growl, but much deeper and louder. Sarah, who's usually our most level-headed team member, suggested we take a break to assess. While we were huddled together discussing whether to continue, our helmet lights caught something moving in one of the side passages about 50 feet ahead. Dave quickly raised his camera and managed to snap several photos. Looking at the camera's LCD screen, we could see something massive and dark moving in the frame. The image was grainy due to the low light, but you could clearly make out a large hair-covered figure moving along the passage wall. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, given how close it was to the ceiling. That's when the smell hit us again, stronger than ever, and we heard what sounded like heavy breathing coming from multiple directions. The cave acoustics made it impossible to pinpoint the source. Our lights caught glimpses of movement in several of the side passages, creating shadows that seemed to shift and move. Mike, who'd been bringing up the rear, suddenly grabbed my shoulder. He'd been watching our back trail and swore he saw 2 reflective eyes watching us from about 100 feet back, way too high up to be any normal cave creature. We made the decision to retreat, but we wanted to document as much as we could on the way out. Dave kept his camera rolling while we moved. The vocalizations followed us, sometimes sounding like they were right around the corner, other times seeming to come from deep within the cave system. About halfway back to the entrance, we found more evidence. Fresh breaks in the flowstone formations that hadn't been there on our way in. Whatever had made those breaks had to be incredibly strong. Flowstone is essentially natural concrete. We also found more of those woven vegetation structures, these ones smaller but definitely made the same way. Some contained what appeared to be partially eaten deer carcasses, but the way the bones were broken was unlike anything I'd seen before. They appeared to have been cracked open, presumably to get at the marrow, but the force required to do that would be enormous. The last few hundred feet to the exit were the longest of my life. We could hear movement behind us, heavy footsteps that seemed to be keeping pace with us, but staying just out of sight. The musky smell would intensify and fade, like whatever was following us was moving through connecting passages parallel to ours. When we finally reached the entrance around 1 p.m., we practically ran the last 100 feet. The sunlight had never looked so good. We didn't stop to rest until we'd put at least half a mile between us and the cave entrance. Looking through our documentation later, most of the photos of the figure came out too blurry or dark to be conclusive, but we had clear images of the tracks, the vegetation structures, and the broken formations. The audio recordings from our backup cameras picked up those vocalizations, sounds that wildlife biologists we've consulted haven't been able to match to any known species. We reported our findings to the local authorities and the landowner. A follow-up investigation was done, but by then, most of the evidence had been disturbed. The vegetation structures were gone, and recent rains had washed away most of the tracks. They found some hair samples caught on the rocks, but the DNA testing was inconclusive. I've been back to Mountain View many times since then for other projects, but I've never returned to that cave. The landowner eventually had the entrance sealed for safety reasons. Sometimes I wonder if he knew something about what was in there before he contacted us. The 4 of us still get together for cave explorations, but we're a lot more cautious now. We've never encountered anything like that before or since, but the experience changed how we approach every cave. Something was living in that cave system. Something large, intelligent enough to build structures, and definitely not supposed to exist. I've gone over that day thousands of times in my head, trying to find some rational explanation for what we encountered. But when I remember those footprints, those structures, that massive shape moving in the darkness, and those deep, resonating vocalizations, I know what we experienced was real, even if I can't explain exactly what it was. I still have those recordings and photos locked away in a safe deposit box. Sometimes I think about releasing them, but I know they'd just be dismissed as fake. Plus, part of me doesn't want to draw attention to that area again. Whatever we encountered that day, maybe it's better if it stays hidden in those caves undisturbed. Story 22. I've spent over 15 years studying nocturnal birds in the forests of New England, but what happened during my research in Newport, Maine, still haunts me to this day. I need to share this because I can't make sense of it, and maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. It was late April 2011, and I was conducting a study on barred owl populations in the more remote areas of Newport. The location was perfect, about 12 miles from the nearest town, deep in a heavily wooded area near the Sebastian Stream forest. I'd been working there for about 3 weeks, mainly during night hours, since that's when barred owls are most active. That night started like any other. I arrived at my research site around 7:30 p.m., just before sunset. The weather was unusually warm for April, around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light breeze and partial cloud cover. I had my usual gear: recording equipment, night vision monocular, LED headlamp, GPS unit, and my research journals. I also carried bear spray, which was standard protocol for working in these areas. The first few hours were routine. I was at my usual observation point, a small clearing about half a mile from the logging road where I'd parked my truck. I had 3 recording stations set up in a triangular pattern, each about 100 yards apart, to capture owl calls and responses. Around 10:30 p.m., I started noticing something odd. The forest had gone completely silent. No spring peepers, no insects, nothing. Anyone who spent time in the woods knows this usually means a predator is nearby. I initially assumed it was a mountain lion or bear, but something felt different. The silence was absolute, and it lasted much longer than usual. Then I started picking up strange sounds on my audio equipment. At first, I thought it was interference, but when I played it back, I could clearly hear what sounded like deep, rhythmic vocalizations, nothing like any animal I'd documented in 15 years of field research. The sounds were complex, not just simple calls, but what seemed like patterns. They'd start low, almost infrasonic, then rise to a pitch just within human hearing range, lasting 45, 50 seconds each time. I've worked with vocal patterns of various species, but this was structured in a way I'd never encountered. The closest comparison I could make would be if you combined whale songs with primate vocalizations, but even that doesn't quite describe it. Around 11:45 p.m., I noticed something that made my blood run cold. About 150 yards from my position, I saw what looked like a structure made of broken tree limbs. Now, I'm familiar with natural deadfall patterns and how storms can create weird arrangements of branches. This was different. The branches were deliberately woven together, creating a rough dome shape about 7 feet high. Some of the branches were freshly broken. I could smell the raw wood. What really got to me was finding several large stones placed in specific positions around the structure. These weren't random. They formed a rough semicircle facing east. I started taking photos and notes, trying to maintain my scientific objectivity, but my hands were shaking. That's when I heard it. Heavy footsteps, moving with a rhythm that was distinctly bipedal. Not a bear, not a moose. Whatever it was walking on 2 legs, and it was big. I switched to my night vision monocular, and that's when I saw it. About 80 yards away, moving between the trees, was a figure that stood at least 8 feet tall. Its movements were fluid, almost graceful for something so large. Through the monocular, I could make out dark, thick hair covering its body, but its face seemed more bare. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, hanging down past its knees. The creature moved with purpose, stopping occasionally to touch trees or pick things up from the ground. What struck me most was how it used its hands. There was clear dexterity in its movements. At one point, I watched it deliberately strip bark from a birch tree, using what looked like a crude tool, a fallen branch, to pry it off. The smell hit me next. A powerful, musky odor mixed with something like wet dog and rotting vegetation. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I've encountered bears, moose, and all sorts of wildlife, but nothing has ever smelled quite like this. Then it did something that still gives me nightmares. It stopped, turned its head directly toward my position, and just stood there. I'm certain it couldn't see me. I was well concealed in my blind, and there was no way it could have heard me over the equipment noise. But somehow, it knew exactly where I was. The vocalizations started again, but this time without any recording equipment needed. They were coming from multiple directions, at least 3 distinct sources. They were communicating with each other, using those same complex patterns I'd picked up earlier. The creature near me would make a call, and others would respond from different locations in the forest. This went on for about 20 minutes. What happened next makes the least sense of all. The creature reached down and picked something up from the forest floor. Even in the dim light, I could see it was one of my audio sensors, one that had been placed 100 yards away. It examined it, turning it over in its hands with what I can only describe as deliberate curiosity. Then, instead of destroying it, it carefully placed it on a fallen log, in plain sight, as if it wanted me to find it. The creature then made one final vocalization, different from the others, almost like a low, resonant hum, and walked away with that same fluid stride. I could hear its footsteps getting fainter, moving deeper into the forest. The other vocalizations gradually stopped, and about 10 minutes later, the normal forest sound slowly returned. I stayed in my blind for another hour, too terrified to move. When I finally got up the courage to leave, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk. I collected my equipment, including the sensor it had moved, which was completely intact, and got back to my truck as quickly as I could. The next day, I went back in daylight with a local game warden. We found massive footprints, 17 inches long and 8 inches wide, near where I'd seen the creature. The stride length was enormous, over 6 feet between prints. We also found hair samples caught on some bark, which I collected and sent to a lab. The results came back inconclusive. The DNA was primate, but didn't match any known species. I've spent the last 12 years trying to rationalize what I saw that night. I'm a scientist. I deal in facts, data, and observable phenomena. But what I encountered defies conventional explanation. The level of intelligence displayed, the tool use, the complex vocalizations, the deliberate placement of my equipment, it all points to something far beyond what we typically attribute to known wildlife. I still have the audio recordings and photos of the footprints and structure. The vocalizations have been analyzed by several experts in bioacoustics, but no one can definitively identify them. I've never gone public with this before because I feared for my professional reputation. But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't anything currently recognized by science. The most unsettling part? In the years since, I've heard from other researchers who've had similar experiences in the same area, but like me, they've been reluctant to come forward. Whatever's out there, it's intelligent, it's organized, and it's been watching us far more carefully than we've been watching it.